Okay. Good morning, everyone. Hello. Can we make a start? Never. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. If we can settle down. Good morning, everyone. Absolutely a bad idea having cabaret style when everyone's getting together and you've got to shut everyone up at the beginning, so sorry about that. I'm Peter Young. I'm chair of the Business Interest Group and member of the Programme Advisory Group for the Value in Nature programme, and together with Guy Duke over there, who will set the scene after our welcome address, we'll be steering you through the day. I hope it's going to be a very stimulating and interesting day. Thank you very much for all of you for getting here on time on a Friday. This is a special one-off business impact conference celebrating the successes of the Valuing Nature programme, but also spending particularly this afternoon looking to the future. So without further ado, I want to move straight to our opening address. I'm delighted to invite Sir Duncan Wingham, long-term Chief Executive and now, I think, Executive Chair of the Natural Environment Research Council, popularly known as NERC, part of UK Research and Innovation. And Duncan, you're going to make an opening address. So, over to you. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, and thank you too for allowing me just to say a few words to introduce this conference. I think one of the mistakes it's possible to make as a Chief Executive of Research Council is to pretend that you know more about a subject than the audience in front of you. So maybe I'll just try and illustrate that. I have been around, as Peter said, long enough to be more or less held responsible for everything. And one of those things was about 6-7 years ago. I was having an internal conversation, and a proposal was made to me that we should have a research program on something called Valuing Nature. And I rather skeptically said, well, does anybody know how to do this? And I got quite a large number of long answers, but my summary of all those answers at that time would have been no, actually. Now, if I wind just the clock forward 6 years, and that's not really a very long period of time, we are now in a situation where we have two very substantial acts going through Parliament in the environment and in agriculture, both of which are completely informed by the ideas of valuing nature. In addition, we have the arrival of green finance and the probable arrival of regulation that will require businesses to place environmental risk on their balance sheet. And so in an extraordinarily short piece of time, short length of time, we've seen this transformation, importance in the ideas around valuing nature. And one could remark that it's just about time we did, because if we don't achieve an ability to value nature, we're not going to have much left pretty soon. I think the other theme I would just like to pick up on is with the arrival of UKRI, NERC is no longer a sovereign body, it's just one of a number of bodies that now have a responsibility not simply to pursue research within its remit, but to pursue research which is aimed at dealing with problems at the national level, irrespective in some ways of the communities whose research we need in order to provide solutions. And in addressing that question from a NERC perspective, I have been of the view for many years that without engaging quite centrally with the business community, it is impossible to see how one can arrive at solutions to environmental problems which, on the one hand, do go some way to protecting our environment, but on the other allow us, to some extent at least, to continue to enjoy the living standards that we do. And so it's really encouraging to me to see this meeting come together today, and also, if I just look down the list of attendees, to see that actually, as far as I can see, business representatives here today are in the majority. And that, I think, is probably the first time I've ever seen that in a conference that's come out of one of our research programs. and again just illustrates just how centrally important the issue of valuing nature has become. So I first of all again welcome you, encourage you to make the most of today. There is a hint, I think, in the agenda that we might be generous again, so you never know, but do your best to build a case. And let me offer you all the best for today and a very interesting session. So thank you very much.
Well, many thanks to Duncan for being with us today to open the conference. We're very grateful, of course, to NERC for their financial support and technical input to the work leading up to this conference and financial support for the conference itself. Before we hear from our keynote speakers, I'd like to provide some brief context for today's event. I'm Guy Duke, so I lead the business interface work for the Valuing Nature program as a member of the program coordination team. The Valuing Nature program has been running for a number of years. We're coming towards the end of the program. Today's conference, Valuing Nature Research and Innovation in Support of Business, builds on the wide range of work that has taken place under the Valuing Nature program. The program has run for 5 years and has received some £6.5 million worth of funding from a number of research councils, NERC, but also ESRC, BBSRC, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council, as well as from DEFRA. And the program has focused on getting us a better understanding and representation of the complexities of the natural environment in valuation analyses and decision making. And funded research projects have focused in particular on health and well-being. We've had 4 health and well-being projects, so health and well-being values of nature, and on tipping point issues. The coordination team, of which I'm a part, has led a range of events and activities that supported researchers in making links with policy, with business, and with practitioners. So the focus of this conference is on the business community. And while we are focusing on the business community, there is, of course, significant relevance also for policy community and practitioners in both the public and private sectors. Our conference today has 2 main purposes. First, we're going to champion and review the business impact of the relevant research and innovation implemented under the Valuing Nature program. And second, we're going to look forward to collaboration between the business, research, and policy communities on a major new natural assets research and innovation agenda in support of business. Business activities under the Valuing Nature program are the focus of our second session this morning, so after coffee, so after this keynote session. And then this afternoon we'll dedicate to the forward look to this emerging natural assets research and innovation agenda in support of business. Let me just provide a little bit more background on how we've got to this point and how this emerging agenda is coming to bear. Over the last 24 months or so, at the instigation of our business interest group led by Peter Young and with support from NERC, we've been carrying out work to better understand what are the research and innovation needs of business in relation to measuring and valuing nature. This has involved 3 high-level sector roundtables with 3 key business sectors: the infrastructure sector, the land management sector, and the insurance and financial services sector. And each of those has looked at what is the current activity in that sector in relation to measuring and valuing nature, and how that is affecting business decision making. What's driving that activity? What are the barriers to greater uptake by businesses of thinking around natural assets in their decision making? And perhaps most of interest to NERC, what are the particular research and innovation needs of business going forward in relation to natural assets. Following these round tables, we carried out a cross-sector analysis, looking at the commonalities and differences across those three sectors in terms of their activity, drivers, barriers, and research and innovation needs. And we also looked at if ACRI, NERC and others were to allocate resources to address these needs, what might be the delivery options for that. Over the last month or so, we have gone out with that analysis, with that cross-sector analysis of the research and innovation needs of business to the policy community. We've spoken to around 30 representatives across the policy community, including key departments in central government, including DEFRA, Treasury, BASE, Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and the Office for National Statistics. We've spoken to the devolved administrations. We've spoken to arm's length bodies such as Natural England, Environment Agency, Natural Resources Wales and Scottish Natural Heritage, and also relevant committees and commissions such as the Natural Capital Committee and the Food Farming Countryside Commission. And the aim of this consultation was to discuss, firstly, the extent to which the emerging natural assets research and innovation agenda in support of business aligns with key direction of travel in policy. Secondly, which of the specific research and innovation needs that have been identified by business most resonate with the policy community. And thirdly, the appetite for collaboration on taking forward this research and innovation agenda. To what extent would the policy community want to engage with business and academia on taking this forward? And I can say that in general, we're still digesting all of that, but in general, the finding from those conversations is that there is substantial alignment, that most of the research and innovation needs that business have been expressing to us do resonate with policy makers, and that there is significant appetite to engage in taking forward such an agenda. Sorry, those are the key questions. Just last week, 10 days ago, we convened a cross-sector workshop also here at the Royal Society, where we brought back participants of our 3 sector roundtables, and we also brought in a sprinkling of policy makers and academia to give further thought to the research and innovation needs and where the priorities might lie, and also the delivery options for these needs. And we will be pulling together the findings of that workshop and the outcomes of today's conference to better shape this natural assets research and innovation agenda in support of business. So to date, well over 100 representatives from business, policy, academia, and indeed the third sector have contributed to our thinking on this emerging agenda. And we're delighted to see today so many representatives, particularly from business, but also from policy, civil society, and academia in the room today. Collaboration across these 4 communities, business, policy, academia, and third sector, is critical in shaping and implementing this agenda going forward. I'd like also to acknowledge the contribution made by many of the business representatives who, over the last 5 years, have sat on our business interest group, the BIG, as we call it, which Peter has so ably chaired. Many of our big members are present today and have fed into the work leading into this conference. So many thanks for this valuable input. And we've had, of course, valuable input from the wider programme coordination team led by Rosie Hales, who unfortunately couldn't make it today, and the Programme Advisory Group and Programme Executive Board. We have 3 keynotes now representing a business perspective, a policy perspective, and an academic perspective on the need for this natural assets research and innovation agenda in support of business. Why is such research and innovation needed, and why is it so timely? So it gives me a great pleasure first to hand over to our first keynote, Sir Ian Cheshire. Both Peter and I were privileged to work several years ago under Ian's leadership. as chair of the government-appointed Ecosystem Markets Task Force, Peter as a member of the task force, and myself leading the evidence team. Ian's a leading advocate, as many of you will know, for greater uptake in both business and policy of research and innovation for protection and restoration of nature. He brings valuable insight from leadership roles in both business and government. So Ian, we greatly appreciate your finding time to be with us here today and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along and also giving me the opportunity to say a few words, and I'll try and keep it sort of short. I'm conscious this is a fairly massive topic, and it's slightly sobering to think that it's 7 years since we published the Ecosystems Task Force report, and I think we've got one thing done so far. So this is a long and sort of somewhat challenging process, but one I think which is absolutely essential. So I'm really pleased to see this pieces of work and potentially the next phase. I just want to make sort of 4 points from a business, and I suppose now I'm an imposter banker as well, so business and finance perspective. The first is that business and finance actually does want to value nature. It wants to make better decisions. It needs help doing it, particularly when we come on to talk about the toolkit and maybe the measures and the sort of demos that we can do. But fundamentally, I think we now understand in the business and finance world that there is that level of responsibility, not just for our externalities that we directly touch on, but a broader sense of responsibility that business has to play in the transition that Duncan talked about, and a sense that it is no longer someone else's job. There's still an enormous amount of confusion and uncertainty about how to make the next step. But if I contrast it to maybe 10, 15 years ago, certainly when I was running Kingfisher, talking to people about the role that business could play, I got a lot of blank looks from various chief execs saying, but that's nothing to do with me. I think the businesses now understand it, partly because of the cohort coming through, but also because of the, frankly, the emergency that is now perceived around climate and biodiversity has really been, I think, recognised in a way that wasn't true 10, 15 years ago. So I think on a positive note, business is very interested to understand how it could value nature better, how it can make the right long-term decisions and come up with a sustainable set of business models. To do that, it really does need some help from science-based, evidence-based frameworks. If you think that the business world has had over 500 years of practice at double-entry bookkeeping accounting, and it's got about 5 minutes experience of natural capital and thinking about assets in a different way. This is something that is still in very early days. And a lot of people, again, Duncan's comment, I had exactly the same issue when we started the Ecosystems Task Force, was how on earth do you measure one of these? You know, I can talk about a ton of carbon, but what's a ton of biodiversity? I don't understand how we do any of that. So I think we are now equipping ourselves more and more with the tools and the understanding and the measurement systems, but these are really not, if you like, well-practiced skills. And so having a solid research underpinning and particularly helping people demonstrate with tests and pilots and how you scale some of those pilots is a really massive contribution. And business can't really do that on its own. We're very keen to come to the party, but we need, I think, quite a lot more help. And to my mind, one of my takeaways is that I learned a colossal amount from the rest of the team, including people like Ian Bateman, who was also part of it. When they started to put some sort of measurement and toolkit around it, I found that a lot easier to talk about how, for example, the value of a forest goes up if it's near an urban centre, which makes sense because of the access benefits, and there is such a thing as being able to have too many trees if you put them in the wrong place. So I think the sort of toolkit, the science, the evidence is a really fundamental part. And business needs help and sort of probably, frankly, being very basic about it, Duncan, research funding to help teams like guys make these sort of advances. I think the third thing we'd like to see from a business point of view is a coordination amongst the various parties so we don't reinvent the wheel the whole time. There are lots of great bits of work going on in various different places. A sense that if we could have a coordinated approach to this agenda and a thoughtful approach to where research and innovation is happening on which topics. And obviously there's a natural desire for all sorts of institutions to put their best foot forward. But given how difficult this challenge is, the last thing we really need to do is have people squabbling over the same territory. So if we could have an integrated map of the R&I agenda and say, well, who's doing what, and be willing to sort of allocate, if you're really good in this area, then great, you do that and we'll do this, I think requires a coming together around this agenda and a generosity maybe perhaps amongst the institutions to focus on where they can add more comparative advantage. I think the fourth and final thing I'll just say briefly now is the other party to make this all happen is the government and various forms of regulation and incentive, and also probably direct government investment. If you're going to build something as big as HS2, you might want to think about how that plays out in terms of sort of natural capital. But I think we will need to see a direct link to the policy agenda. I think the sheer fact we've got an environment bill, the sheer fact that we've got the degree of conversation at these levels and to my mind, the opportunity, particularly in the farming sector, which we've been looking at through the Food Farming Countryside Commission, to think differently about how subsidies and incentives work, makes this a really critical juncture. And I frequently, I'm afraid, cite the example of how business and regulation can combine for positive effect as being the landfill tax. Once we knew as businesses what the playing field looked like, how that was going to work, we could suddenly look at our waste streams and say, right, what do we do about it? In the same way that, frankly, 5p on a plastic bag has produced a behaviour shift in consumers. So we can, as a business community and a finance community, work with regulation. It's not an anti-regulation piece, but it has to be effective, smart regulation, and above all, a level playing field. So the final example I would use is I'm currently chairing a small task force on Britain's global footprint, GRI task force, and one of the things we want to do is try and set up Britain legally to stop importing deforestation. Now, to do that, one of the things we have to do is have clarity on due diligence of where product is coming from. And if we do that as an industry, the costs are shared, the playing field is level, and frankly, the cost won't be that great. And I think those sorts of smallish but quite clear interventions are going to be needed in lots of different areas. And I think the challenge for us when we think about this as a broader business and finance community is a massive, massive waterfront we're trying to cover. And I think rather than try and be defeated by that, we have to start making progress in a number of quite specific areas. So stopping importing deforestation strikes me as a pretty incontrovertible thing. Why wouldn't we want to do that? But equally, there are lots of things to do with decarbonising our energy system, switching the transport system. There is a long, long list into which we need this, again, this science-based, research-based understanding of how we correctly value nature. And so the final micro example I would leave you with, which came out of our work on the Food and Farming Countryside Commission, was a long-term desire to find a way, and this is also very relevant for Barclays as we bank 25% of the country's farmers, of tying the subsidies we give to farmers to a natural capital balance sheet at a farm level. Now, one of the challenges there is no one's got any measurement around that. No one knows how to do it at the moment. Conceptually, it sounds really straightforward, and conceptually, it's sort of what lies behind the ELMS schemes. But could we find a piece of research and innovation that would allow us to find farmers a really easy, practical, low-cost way of doing this, ideally with data that is automatically read in from a variety of other places? They don't have to fill in 8 million forms. And could we enable that so that there is a real alignment there between the money that we as public are giving for public goods and actually a natural capital analysis that is practical and useful? And those sorts of, that example is just one of a whole series of other things we can do in other areas. But it has to be underpinned by this willingness of business and finance to do it, a real desire to find the sort of evidence-based rather than just sort of stumble in and make things up, a real desire to collaborate, and then finally a real need for the government and regulatory framework to be brought to bear. I'm incredibly optimistic despite the 7-year sort of cycle of getting from one report to one initiative, because we have to keep going. And I'm really pleased to see the work that the team have been doing here today and would thoroughly recommend it. So with that, I will make way for the next keynote. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank Thank you very much indeed. So next up, we've probably got actually the most knowledgeable person in DEFRA for this agenda, and you can perhaps work out why that might be. Alistair Johnson's currently head of the Natural Environment Economics within DEFRA, and I think you lead the team that recently launched that online resource enabling a natural capital approach, or ENCA, I think it's got as its inevitable acronym. Since 2002, Alistair's worked across various policy areas within DEFRA, including rural strategy and agri-environment, has a deep knowledge of the challenges and opportunities of policy making in this environmental field.
Oh, thanks very much. So I head up Natural Environment Economics within DEFRA, which covers both national and international environmental policy, including the 25-year Environment Plan, the Environment Bill, and Green Finance Strategy. So there's no pressure there then. I also sit on NERC's RISE and VMP programme boards. And with this presentation, I would like to take you through the challenges, progress, and future opportunities from a policy perspective with respect to the environment. And along the way, bring out the need for research, innovation support to business and policy to support the effective rollout of all of this policy. So, as has already been mentioned, the awareness of the environment has been certainly increasing. I joined the civil service about 25 years ago, and one of the first jobs that I had to do was actually value the biodiversity of Britain's public forest estate. And an academic colleague had done some research on biodiversity and its term amongst the general public. And the responses were not really that encouraging, to say the least. But the most memorable one was, yes, biodiversity is extremely important because it gets my clothes so white. And I think even today, the term biodiversity, if you ask 10 people, you'll get 11 answers. So the terminology and the way it keeps changing really doesn't help matters. But it's clear that things have changed and the public awareness has definitely grown. Now, this lays out just a fraction of the... That's right, yes. This lays out just a fraction of the issues at hand. What can be quite obvious from this is that the numbers aren't small, and that there's a definite gap between where we want to be and where we are. And the indicators show that the situation is a poor one, that we're going in the wrong direction, or that we're only making very slow progress. And we've had the UK National Ecosystem Assessment of 2011, and the more recent IPBES Global Assessment provides further evidence of a declining situation in the many areas that we all face. So we had the 25-year Environment Plan. That was published, over 2 years ago now. Time flies. The aim of this was to leave the environment in a better state than we inherited it, a term that actually came from the 2011 White Paper. And this has led to a string of policies. It also stated the solutions required all of us to be involved, not just government, but also it looked towards the consumers and the private sector to find the solutions and to deliver them. And just on a more personal note, the 25-year plan also came with a rather excellent evidence annex, which I recommend all of you to read. It provided the evidence of what we knew at the time, and we were very aware of the following Sir Ian's point, of the very diffuse nature of the evidence base, its confusing nature and its gaps. An evidence base that both government and business needs if we want to successfully deal with the environmental challenges that we're facing. So moving on from the challenges onto the progress. So the Environment Bill was reintroduced to Parliament on the 30th of January in 2020 and sets out how we plan to protect and improve the natural environment in the UK. It covers a wide range of issues and places the 25-year plan onto a statutory footing, ensuring the environment is at front and centre of policy making. The bill was prepared through consultations with the public on numerous measures, including environmental governance, the clean air strategy, biodiversity net gain, trees, conservation covenants, extended producer responsibilities, recycling, deposit return scheme and water. To say it was a vast bill is rather an understatement. It'll help to manage the impacts of human activity on the environment, creating a more sustainable and resilient economy while enhancing well-being and quality of life. It will engage and empower citizens, local government and businesses to deliver environmental outcomes. And then we have the waste strategy and the clean air strategy. In relation to the Green Bill, it introduces a series of measures that will fundamentally change the way the government, businesses and individuals produce and consume products. It will help move our economy away from the take, make, use, throw away system to a more circular model, with key policies around resource efficiency standards, extended producer responsibility and single-use plastic items. And then on the marine side, we have delivered the most significant expansion of England's blue belt to date. We've backed plans by Ascension Islands to designate over 150,000 square miles of its waters as fully protected, no-take marine protected area. And we have published a fisheries white paper and the first fisheries bill in over 40 years. And on the trees and nature side, we've announced £50 million of funding for a new woodland carbon guarantee, and we have strengthened protections for ancient woodlands and veteran trees and other irreplaceable habitats. And then on a more social side, there is the need to engage the general public. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lack of understanding of certain terms such as biodiversity. But in order to make a success of this, we need to engage and people's behaviours and attitudes towards the environment. And so, again, with the 25-year plan, I'm sure you've all read it and can quote it verbatim, and that you'll know Chapter 3 inside out. But connecting people with the environment is one of the key elements coming out of the 25-year plan, and in particular, engaging children with nature, because if we can do that, then hopefully the future will be a lot brighter in taking forward and delivering the environmental policies that we need. So in terms of opportunities, the Environment Bill presents us with quite a lot, and I've already mentioned the areas that it covers. Around tackling, have we lost the microphone? Can you hear me still? Great, okay, fine, sorry. Case of tackling biodiversity loss, climate change, and environmental risks to the public. And ensuring that the environment is at the front and is in the centre of policy making. Acting as one of the key vehicles for delivering the bold vision set out in the 25-year plan, the Environment Bill brings about urgent and meaningful action to tackle the environmental and climate crises we are now facing. And then we've got the reforming of the Common Agricultural Policy. My own personal background is an agricultural economist, but thankfully this area of work is being tackled by another team of analysts. But we know that the landscape that we favour and we love today is an industrial landscape produced by farming and forestry. However, as mentioned, there are concerns to what is happening to the environment, and the various biodiversity indicators show very worrying trends. The Environment Land Management Scheme will see a shift towards delivery of public goods with public money, and hopefully to contribute towards the commitment of a net zero by 2050. And then we've got the links between climate change and biodiversity. As the climate changes, there are implications for biodiversity, and conversely, biodiversity can help towards addressing climate change. For example, trees can help both with carbon sequestration, assuming they're planted in the right place, of course, but also it can tackle such issues as temperature control within urban settings. However, as we tackle climate change, we need to bear in mind the trade-offs between other aspects of the environment. Covering large swathes of the countryside in solar panels may help solve one problem, but may then generate others. And it's not all about changes of land use and land use industries. As mentioned before, there are opportunities to reuse resources within the wider economy, which in itself presents challenges for businesses and industry. And then we've got the green finance strategy. Needless to say, public funding will continue to be an important element as we go forward. But private finance also has a major role to play in reversing biodiversity loss and aligning financial flows with environmental ambitions. Last year, we published the first green finance strategy, which explores integrating climate and environmental factors into financial decision-making, which is nattily called greening finance. And then we've got increasing the flow of private sector finance to environment and climate projects, also nattily called financing green. And then the third one is positioning the UK as a global green finance hub. But DEFRA is not operating alone. And as mentioned earlier, we have a variety of groups that DEFRA belongs to. And these are just a few of them. And we also have, as mentioned before, the Ecosystems Market Task Force, which delivered its final report in, I think, 2013, where the government's response stated that the task force report delivered a clear message that boosting the economy and improving the environment are not mutually exclusive. It shows that there is a genuine opportunity for the UK to be at the forefront of new exciting markets which value, protect and enhance our natural environment. One of the roles that I do have, one of my other roles, is working with BEIS as the local enterprise partnerships develop their local industrial strategies. And we have been pushing for natural capital to be incorporated within those strategies. To say that it's been a challenge would be an understatement, and that success is still elusive, to say the least. But we need to make that connection between the environment being a contributor to economic growth and not a barrier. And that is, it's more than just the farming sector or the tourism industry, but rather green infrastructure can help with mental and physical health and well-being, attracting employers into certain areas, help with issues such as urban climate, and also issues around water availability and scarcity. Now, if I may sort of take this opportunity, Chair, just to plug ENCA. Thank you very much. This was launched on the 22nd of January, and to follow Sir Ian's point, which is an extremely valid one, that our stakeholders told us that the evidence base was very confusing, there was not enough of it, there was too much of it, and I have no idea where I'm meant to be starting. ENCA, for the first time, we have tried to provide a single point where we have guidance, we have economic values, we have data, we have case studies, we have featured tools which allow individuals easy access to start understanding what natural capital is about, but also for those who are more familiar with natural capital to provide them with the evidence that they need. Now, when we put this together, which has taken quite a bit of time to say the least, we realised that there were evidence gaps. And we need industry and also the academia to help us develop this even further. So hopefully to make it a tool, a resource that all can understand and use. So far, it's been a very positive response to various parts of stakeholders, but I'm sure we can make it even better. So before I finish, I just want to make the 3 final points. And the first one is that there is a clear evidence that there is a need for action, and that beyond government, there is a need for input from the private sector and academia, and that there is a need for evidence, not just economic, but social and science. And so I look forward to the output from this programme of work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Alistair. And after we've completed these keynotes, we'll be opening up to the floor for questions for our keynote speakers. So last but certainly not least, Sir Giles Cobber is here to give his keynote. Charles is director at the Oxford Martin School and Professor of Population Biology at Oxford University, where he pursues broad interest in science and the interplay between science and policy. He chaired the lead expert group on the future of food and farming, and he's currently chair of DEFRA's Science Advisory Council. And he even found time to be a member of the Valuing Nature Programme coordination team as well. Thank you, Charles.
Thanks very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I have been involved with the Valuing Nature programme since its inception. And it's been enormous fun working with Guy Duke, who's done a great job keeping us clear about the business agenda. And Guy asked me to do 3 things. First, to ask whether there's an appetite for academia engaging with this agenda. And that's the easy one to do, because the answer is just yes. It's yes for 2 reasons. There's a cynical reason: if you pay academics money, you'll get their attention. But the real reason is that there has been a real cultural change in our community, the academic community, that matches the cultural change that Ian talked about in the business community. And it is bringing things together. And within the academic community, there is, right from our students up to established researchers, a real enthusiasm about engaging with policymakers and engaging with businesses, which frankly just wasn't there 20 years ago. Guy also asked me to sort of be a bit more specific about where we can contribute, which I'm about to do, and then today say a few things about how our community, the research community, can do better in providing some of the evidence base. So this is a rhetorical question: why should business care about valuing nature? Now, obviously, the answer to that is you should go and ask a businessman. But last night when I was putting this slide together, there wasn't one about, so I've tried to do it, but have been informed by the 3 really interesting papers that Guy talked about from the roundtable. So my take on it, which has sort of roughly matched what Ian was saying, that business cares about it because it can directly affect your bottom line through improved profits, through avoided costs, and especially many of the NERT community, one of the big contributions we can make is to try and avoid and try and reduce costs that would occur otherwise. And it can also be a business opportunity. I keep hearing this heavenly music. I hope the angels aren't coming along to take me away. And it can also be a business opportunity. One can create the circumstances by which business can both create value themselves and do things good for the environment. And then, and this reflects back to what Ian was saying, there is an increasing realization that it is the right thing to do. And many of these issues are moving out what can be a sort of CSR-type ghetto into much more mainstream. And I'm plugging here a book by my colleague Colin Meyer at the Oxford Business School, also a member of the Natural Capital Committee, a book on prosperity, where he talks through some of these issues about how there are changing views within the business community about what the purpose is of a company. And then, of course, it can be required to do by regulators. It can be required to think about natural capital by regulators or by customers. So Benefits to the bottom line. So what do we need to do in the research community there? Well, we need a better understanding of ecosystem functioning. So we know a lot about ecosystem functions. It is not an excuse not to try and put that agenda into developing real metrics and such. But we need to do much more. There is a real role for investment in fundamental science to create the intellectual capital that will have better applied science down the line. So don't ever think that there isn't a role for pure discovery science, which doesn't have a direct link today with applications. So we must not forget that. But similarly, we mustn't throw up our hands and say we need to go back and just do pure research before we can do anything. All communities have culture, and business has culture as well. And certainly in parts of business, there is a default to the way you go and try and cure a problem. And we're seeing that at the moment in some of the discussions around how we respond to the flooding crises that we see at the moment, and I fear is likely to increase as we see more and more the effects of climate change. And in the old days, you would just build a bigger barrier. And there may be a default that one goes for technological infrastructure engineering solutions, whereas there are possible nature-based solutions that can do as well and simultaneously produce other other public goods. And there's an initiative, well, there's several initiatives. I'm quoting one here from Oxford, led by Nat Seddon, on trying to bring together the evidence base for natural-based solutions. Now, as both Ian and Alistair have both said, there's enormous excitement at the moment, interdisciplinary interest between meshing natural science and social science agendas, and trying to understand how one can create markets, how one can create incentives, how one can create new initiatives in green financing. And to me, this is one of the most interesting areas in contemporary interdisciplinary research. And I think that there's a real need for more research in trying to develop these tools, but also to try and understand what the unexpected outcomes are going to be. Alistair talked about some of the really interesting ideas that DEFRA are exploring at the moment about what will replace CAP. Now, if you look through and if you look at the economics and the political economy, there are going to be some really interesting change, major potential shifts of resources from different communities within the rural economy. And we need to understand these. And this is an area where research that spans multiple research councils is, I think, really important. And we need to understand natural assets. We need to understand stranded natural assets. So stranded assets is pretty well understood as a concept within the extractive industries. I think when we're looking at other industries, including farming, then some of the assets that we think we have at the moment may not have the valuation that we think they have, especially if we are serious about net zero. That is going to lead to a painful and radical restructuring of agriculture, both in this country and elsewhere. Now, some of my friends in industry who, when they read a book like Colin's book on purpose and things, they say, yes, we get that, but how do you actually measure it? And I think one of the things that to me came out of very strongly of the three roundtable discussions is this issue around data availability, and analytics. I think we need to have a discussion about how we produce the natural capacity, the natural capability to have these nationwide databases. Some of the investment that we've put in the past in collecting some of these data resources has been challenged as funding has gone down. And I think this also goes back to a point that Ian made about having an integrated map of what we need as a nation for R&I in this agenda, and especially around data. I think there are some some conflicts there, some tensions there and things. So the degree to which data is a public good, that should be made available for everyone, and the degree to which it should be monetarized. And certainly, I hope Alistair will forgive me on that if I say this, I think DEFRA sometimes struggles with that, in that DEFRA does see that data as a public good can stimulate all sorts of things, but then Treasury is on your back saying, wherever you can, you should be monetarizing this. As I increasingly become an old fart and don't do anything with my hands in the lab, I do more and more citizen science as an absolutely obsessive natural historian. And so I am absolutely passionate about what citizen science can do and helping this agenda, and the capacity out there for citizen science to do it, and the way that we can enable citizen science to contribute more, to me, is something really interesting. We need metrics and standards, and we need monitoring. And there's some really interesting, I think, research challenges around monitoring. So we want to reward, for example, farmers who do good things to their soil, so less of it goes into rivers. We can do really fabulous things now using remote sensing, using fixed monitors within rivers, and with modeling as well to work out actually where sediments come from. So there is a capacity, if not now, certainly in a few years, to be able to give real feedback to individual farmers about what they do. And what about the last thing, where business is required to do? Well, we've already heard about natural capital accounting, and we need research into making that operational. I was at the Oxford Farming Conference just after Christmas, and in several panel discussions with industry there, they said exactly what Ian said, that industry is not necessarily against regulation, but they want it brought in a smart way. They want it brought in with a sufficient time period you can justify investment into meeting those regulatory goals. The one thing I would say is that often the parts of business that are most potentially accepting of regulation are the bigger companies, and it can be poorly designed regulation can be a barrier to new entrants. So that, I think, again, is something that needs to be looked at. And as someone who is really enthusiastic about the natural capital approaches, one must be honest about its limitations. And I worry sometimes when you get the sort of fundamentalist wing of the economics profession who will say, actually, it can provide all the answers. It's really, really invaluable. But sometimes it will be so complex that actually you're better doing it by a different mechanism. And sometimes, and this is issues that philosophers such as Michael Sandel have talked a lot about, sometimes the mere fact of monetizing an issue can lead to perverse outcomes. So please don't misunderstand any lack of enthusiasm, but just some realism about the limitations of where natural capital approach stops. And then finally, as a natural scientist who has embraced economics, we need to go one stage further back and think about the real social sciences. And I like to say it's a political economy, stupid. So if one looks at what I believe is that we're going to have to restructure the livestock sector in this country in order to get to net zero, I am dismayed by the narratives that are developing, the vegan narrative versus the meat is absolutely good and we need to eat more. We need to develop a narrative that goes in between the two. I think if we look at all the political turmoil in this country, in the States, over the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of it is down to having the political economy wrong and having poor narratives. So very briefly turning to the last point now. So how can the research community be better providers of research? Well, I think we have to look about how we can be better at commissioning our research. I think we need to see how we can best foster interdisciplinarity. So everyone agrees interdisciplinarity is good. Sometimes I think we do it in a rather clunky way. I talked about the cultural change that has existed in our community about a greater willingness to engage with these broader agendas. I think, especially within university academia, our incentive structures have not kept up with that. And I would like to see that the way much of the incentives work within the university sector, especially around REF, when we're through the current Research Excellence Framework, we look very carefully about that. I'm a great supporter. So researchers have been asked for the last 10 years or so, I think, Duncan, to have pathways to impact in all their proposals. And this has had both good and bad effects. The good effects is everyone thinks about pathways to impacts. The bad effects is that they've become somewhat devalued in that they're a game that you have to go through. So I actually support the recent initiative that pathways to impacts are not now compulsory. Research should be judged by what it's aiming to do. And really, really good discovery research will not necessarily have a pathway to impact anytime soon. And I don't think you should be made to sort of do the fiction about predicting it into the future. On the other hand, if I'm going to Duncan asking for research to help Ian, then the pathway to impact should be absolutely clear, and that should be a real component of whether I get that money or not. I think we need to look at how the research councils deliver the research. I'm a great supporter of UKRI. I think it has broken down some of the silos that existed between research councils. Duncan, I think not all of them. I think it's still work in progress. I worry about the capacity of the research councils to respond to some of these challenges after 10 years of pretty brutal austerity undermining the number of people there who can actually carry out these things. And I also worry about the mode of the way we have traditionally given out research, nearly always in short 3-year grants. Now, in my career, I've been really lucky. I can write a 3-year grant, but I'm not sure that I've deserved all the grants that I've got. And I think it may be we need to think how better to get research out there. I think we have in this country some wonderful institutions as well. So within the NERC community, there's CEH. Within the BBSRC community, Rothamsted, John Innes. I'm not sure that there is a business model for these organisations at the moment. I think there's some real challenges there. I think they form a real crucial part of the research infrastructure that is going to support the agenda that we're talking about today. I'm not sure we've got the incentives right for the people working in those organisations. I think these are all soluble problems, and not only can they be solved, but that we urgently need to solve them in order to meet these exciting challenges. Thank you very much.
Okay, and if Guy would like to come and join us, we've got half an hour. We'll finish just before 11 to give time for the coffee break. And that's been a fantastic set of insights. Thank you all for setting us up for today. I'm going to take Chair's prerogative and ask each one of our keynotes one question to give you a little bit more time to have a think, and then we'll throw it out to the floor. I'll start with Ian. I mean, you're in an unusual position, I think, because you've got deep involvement, business, finance, and you've seen government at first hand. And I think, you gave us a really good idea of how actually there's no one hit here. There's a lot of things that are needed. But in terms of the help that each of business, finance, and government needs to take this agenda forward, and bearing in mind the different governance and decision-making structures, what do you think are the key barriers that need to be overcome to get better decision-making and better uptake of research and innovation in this area?
Well, I mean, apart from today, it's very refreshing to hear Charles as an academic say he wasn't sure he deserved grants. That's brilliant, because I think that these are really quite difficult areas, actually. I mean, this isn't straightforward, and the main issue that I see from all the business and finance sort of piece, maybe more so than government, is the inability to find actionable tools and measurement. And if I had to come up with one thing, it's measurement and metrics is probably the hardest thing, because, going back to the biodiversity discussion, is if you're talking about soil quality, that's great. If you're talking about wildlife, that's another piece. And there's a real challenge with some of the more esoteric versions of natural capital, as you mentioned. So to my mind, coming up with something where, frankly, the perfect is not the enemy of the good is really important. So a set of frameworks that say, look, we know we're making measurements and approximations, but this is actually actionable, whereas something might be technically interesting but completely useless. And I think trying to find that right balance, because you have to start with fundamental research, and I appreciate that, and I'm at the very sort of tail end of that process, but the bridging bit for me is the bit in the middle, which starts to say, can business start to take some leading edge ideas and then work through them with some technical metrics and frameworks which we can at least validate.
Brilliant, brilliant. Alistair, you've set out a challenging programme. We've got, environment, fisheries, agricultural bills going through. We have a 25-year plan, all the rest of it. What's clear is we're facing a once-in-a-generation change in, I think, our natural assets and the landscape in which they sit. How important is good science and knowledge to underpin that change?
Well, it's absolutely essential. So within government, we have this concept called the policy cycle, where you're meant to start at the beginning with assessing what the issues are, and then identifying opportunities and options, and then appraising them, monitoring and evaluating. And as each of those stages is absolutely essential to have the evidence, because without the evidence, well, you don't know what the issues are to start off with, and you literally are flying blind. There are other aspects that go into policy making around the legal aspects and so forth, but the economics, the science, the social science are critical. And when we do this analysis, we then get it scrutinized by the Treasury or by the Regulatory Policy Committee or a variety of individuals to make sure that we have done as best a job as we can given what we have. And so we can use both quantitative and qualitative evidence. We are allowed to use words, not just numbers. And that allows us to present a narrative which is compelling enough to say, yes, there is a case here, this is the best way of doing it. Because otherwise, we are wasting people's time, we are wasting people's money, and the situation just gets worse. So it's absolutely critical.
Brilliant, brilliant. Charles, you already had a bit of a pop, I think, at the importance of breaking down silos, and that we've made some progress. We need to make more. What I'd like you to just sort of say a little bit more about is how important is coordination and coherence in developing these sort of research and innovation areas going forward?
So I do think breaking down the silos is important. The question is, how do you do it? And I think there's some good evidence about how not to do it. And I remember one of the European Community Framework programs, which probably about 15 years back, which mandated a social scientist on every single program. And so some poor bloody social scientist was put onto a program. It probably did more to harm the value of social science to natural science researchers than anything else. So, and I'm someone who's passionate about the importance of social science. So the way I think it is best to do it is that when research is commissioned, then it's commissioned in a very clear way that the best proposals to address it are interdisciplinary. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the action point on the research councils or the government. I think the action point for our community is to make certain that the social scientist who interacts with the natural science or vice versa is not penalised in his or her career structure, which I think can happen at the moment. And to take a pop at Alistair's profession, I mean, it is daft that in the incentive structure of academic economics is that you have to publish highly mathematical papers in 4 or 5 journals. So most of the, not all, most of the economists I interact with in Oxford aren't in the economics department.
That's a good bit of insight, yeah. Okay, now we're going to open it up to the floor. What I'll do, I think, is probably take sort of two or three at a go. We've got roving mics. If you can introduce yourself and your affiliation before making your question, that would be really helpful.
Yeah.
Right.
Hi, Chris Dodwell from Impacts Asset Management. So I started working in government 20 years ago, and the first policy I worked on was the UK emissions trading system. And it's taken us 20 years to get to a point where you've actually got a carbon price that is really going to bite, and you have companies and funds that are investing on the back of that. We don't have another 20 years, and as Sir Ian was saying, actually, you know, pricing a ton of carbon's the easy piece. So I'd just like to hear from the panel, where do you see things being closest to valuing nature research, actually really the rubber hitting the road and starting to influence business decisions? And how can we kind of have a little bit of confidence that we can push this forward with the urgency that we need to in order to address this? I completely understand the point about needing the evidence base, but we need some way of speeding this policy process up. So how can we have some confidence that that will go forward? Thank you.
Brilliant question, brilliant question. We'll take one more, which will give a little bit of thinking time.
Yeah, my name's Dr. Colin Bow. I'm Senior Lecturer in Environmental Science at Liverpool John Moores University. But I'm also now chairing the Liverpool City Region Natural Capital Working Group. So I guess my question's aimed at Alistair. So one of the things, obviously, we're trying to get the Liverpool City Region to do, the combined authorities and the local authorities, to think about natural capital and incorporate natural capital in their policies and in their actions. So I noticed that you talked about how BEIS was also trying to drive that forward. So I'd be interested to know what mechanisms that BEIS are using to do that and how they're interacting with government at that level.
Okay, excellent. Let's just take those two. So one, I think, for anyone to pick up Chris's point, it's taken us 20 years to get a really decent market running. How do we speed it up?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely share that sort of view about timing. I think, though, the way into this is a slightly more granular levels of impact. So rather than trying to sort of have some complete ocean boiling exercise up here, trying to get in at practical levels. So, you know, the abolition of COP is a classic example where we could actually potentially have more change in agriculture as a result of this shift than we've been able to do for 25 years. So let's take agriculture and try and land that set of changes. Let's take the importing deforestation opportunity and say we can actually stop that and start to plant a series of on-the-ground actions rather than try and wait for perfection to arrive. And I think that it's about empowering enough people in enough different places, and I would include the finance sector in that one. You know, I'd love to be able to lend, again, maybe to a farmer on the basis of their improving the natural capital of their farm, rather than at the moment the value of their agricultural property, which is what is the metric we're using. So I think there's a series of on-the-ground actions in different places, and I know DEFRA's got a huge waterfront to cover, but I think actually now is the time to sort of say, well, okay, let's show up in this area. And actually the point on Liverpool I would take is I think there's a really interesting opportunity at that sort of not sort of parish council, not national government. There's a sort of landscape, landscape set of opportunities, which I think now people are looking to work out how they have an impact there. And I think there's a real lever there to pick up on.
Do you want to, just since you raised it, Alistair, just talk to the Liverpool point as well?
Yes, BEIS has been leading on working with these local enterprise partnerships, which vary in size but are usually made up of several local authorities. And we have been working with them along with other government departments to make sure that the evidence that they are using to develop their own strategies, the local industrial strategies, is coherent, makes sense, and that what they are planning to do is based on reality rather than everybody's going to be a biotech centre for the globe. But I mean, from my perspective, things haven't been that great. The Oxfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership, about 5 years ago, produced a fantastic publication connecting the importance of natural capital with the economy, and I thought that they've got it. But quite often it's the environment is dismissed as either being the 99th page of a 100-page document, which consists of only one paragraph with the phrases of agriculture and tourism and nothing else. So sometimes we will develop our economy despite the environment, which I find quite disheartening. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I think that when it comes to changing attitudes and ultimately behaviours, it is unfortunately a long-term process. It's not something that can be done in a few years. It can take a generation or two, which obviously we don't have, but hence perhaps that's where the regulation might need to come in.
Excellent. Does Charles, Guy, want to say anything on the first?
I would just follow on from what Ian was saying, that I too am really excited by the opportunity to do things different with agriculture and the rural economy in this country. But there are some really, really big challenges out there. If you look at what the government has said about moving towards public money for public good, there is not a consensus out there on what a public good is. Now, if you talk to an economist, there's a very strict definition of what a public good is, but that's not the sort of consensus out there in political economy, where it overlaps with merit goods, which is an interesting concept, but frankly, it also overlaps with private goods, so some parts of the industry reinterpret. I think Theresa May was tricked into Prime Minister's question time, saying that food was a public good. So I think there's some real challenges there. And just going back to the point about political economy, I see it could go two ways. There is a once in a lifetime, once in a generation opportunity to have a real consensus between the agricultural industry and people interested in the environment. Because at the moment we put £3.2 billion a year into the rural economy through CAP, so there is money that can be reallocated, even if Treasury takes some of it back. But I worry deeply about diverging narratives at the moment. If we don't get the politics right, if we don't get the narratives right, we could fail.
Really important. Guy, do you want to just...
Yeah, just briefly, I think, I mean, to answer the first question, the Ecosystem Markets Task Force a few years ago did put out quite a number of opportunities where we could get moving on various new markets that could benefit nature. And one of those that is now on the cusp of being realised is mandatory net gain around housing and other larger scale developments. And the estimate that came forward from the Ecosystem Markets Task Force at the time was that could return around 500 million a year into nature in England alone, which is the scale of agri-environment payments under the cap. So that would be a very significant new way of energising a market to put resource into nature. So I think, as Ian says, it's granular. You can pick up, that would address the construction industry, development industry, infrastructure development, but there are other areas that have been mentioned here where we can pick up agriculture and so on.
Okay, let's take three more. At the back first.
Hello, it's Bruce Howard from the UK-wide Ecosystems Knowledge Network. A question that hopefully will take us to the kind of nub of today, where that many parts of business have their own research and innovation capabilities. I'd just like to ask the panel how we can harness that capability already in the private sector with publicly funded research. Can you bring us down to where the publicly funded research, what it can do that the private sector can't do on its own? Thank you.
Okay, and then here.
Andrew Ross from Global Garden. It's a question for Alistair, if I may. You mentioned the HM Treasury Green Finance strategy, and we're heading for COP26, but the UK is below 20th in the world ranking for issuing green bonds. How do you see HM Treasury addressing this, and are we going to issue a sovereign green bond at COP26 to do what France did with a 20 billion euro bond 5 years ago.
Okay, and I think we've got one more there as well. Yeah, okay, and we'll try and bring to the front.
Thank you.
Next.
I'm Axel Rosberg from Queen Mary University of London. And what we do is we model ecosystems because we want to manipulate them and then make better ecosystems. And it boils down to ecological engineering. And I want to ask you all this question. Does this make you find kind of scared if you want to engineer ecosystems, or you think it's the greatest thing on Earth? Or should we leave things as they are and play out naturally because we don't understand them?
Okay, brilliant. Okay, right, well, we'll let everyone talk to any or all of these. So we've got Bruce asking about the what it is that the public sector can do that the private sector can't, and how to bring those things going together. Andrew asking, I don't know, I think Alistair's in Alistair's gift, but anyone wants to talk about the fact that we're not a major player in the UK at the moment in terms of green bond issuances. And then lastly, is fiddling with our ecosystems really something that we should be doing given our state of knowledge? Anyone for those? Ian?
Right, just on the green finance initiative, slightly involved with COP26 on the edges of it. There will be, I'm pretty sure, a significant strand of green finance initiative in Glasgow, and it will be one of the areas where the UK can convene world action as opposed to make its own action necessarily. So it might not just be about us pushing out some green bonds. I'm pretty sure there will be a sort of broader theme, and Anne-Marie Thomas and others are working on that agenda. So I'm probably more optimistic we will say something. Whether or not it'll be as impressive as France, I don't know. And the point on ecosystems was something we were very conscious of back in the day on the task force. So I think the issue is that we quite clearly are fiddling with our ecosystems anyway. So we better maybe understand the damage we're doing and fix the more obvious things that we can fix. But with the unintended consequences point that Charles has made is, you intervene on one part of an ecosystem and it's a dynamic system, so you probably set off something else. But I think simply accepting what we're doing with the current take, make, dispose model is not okay. So I think we have to try to find a better alternative.
Well, Ian, as a banker, has answered the ecology question much better than I could. I completely agree. And I fear I'm going to address the finance question.
Excellent.
Probably much worse than things. So what can the public sector do that the private sector can't? Well, the obvious thing is where there are market failures, and so that's where government should go in. There is a really lively debate about how far along the chain from fundamental science to market government should go. And those of you who've read books by people like Mariana Mazzucato at UCL will see just what a hot issue that there is. I think, and it came out in one of the roundtable discussions, that the ideas of pre-competitive spaces, which occur in a number of industries, but especially in the pharma sector, which are now well established, that there is a role here. If you look at the comparative statistics for industry investment in research in this country and our major OECD competitors, then we do less than our competitors. And so is there something about our industry that makes it economically rational to invest less? Or is there something about our economy that we're getting, in a sense, a market failure there? And certainly some of my colleagues in the business school at my university would argue that the structure of our economy, with the heavy dominance of finance, the Anglo-American model of finance rather than the continental European, may actually be undermining the amount of research that industry puts in. And if we are to meet it's 2.4%, Duncan, isn't it? The 2.4% target that the government has for GDP going into research, it's probably going to be more of a challenge for the industry component of that, the private sector component of that, than the state component of that. So I think there's some really interesting things here which are perhaps not discussed enough.
That's great. Okay.
So let's see. Well, Ian has probably answered the green finance question better than I could have done, and Charles has answered the market failure question on public private R&D better than I could have done. But sort of to answer Bruce's question or to contribute towards it, I like to think that it's not private or public R&D, but that there is a combination of the two, that there's a combined effort and that one talks to the other and it's coordinated and comparative advantage is used when we move the research agenda forward. With regards to Andrew's question around green finance, about 10 years ago, I think I went to the first Green Bond Finance conference in the city. And the numbers that were being mentioned then were eye-watering. There was about £50 billion just waiting for opportunities to be spent, and that these guys would not get out of bed for anything less than £100 million. And the projects that we think of, you'd be lucky to talk about hundreds of thousands of pounds, let alone millions. But I think probably one of the, I think Ian, perhaps you mentioned it earlier on, why should the private sector get involved in this? I think it's because there's a lot of money potentially out there to tap into. And if the private sector or parts of the private sector start to take this on board, then they can start accessing these pots of money that otherwise would not be available to them. Now, moving on to COP26, who knows what's going to come out of that? I don't know. I think Ian's probably got an inside line. But we'll have to wait and see, and hopefully something good will come and address your concern. I don't know.
Okay, we've got a couple at the front here. If we could take those.
Yep, just the first one. Can we try?
I haven't quite got to them. That's fine. No, there, and then these two here. Go ahead, sir.
Go on, John.
John Gossage, NRW. It was said that business has had double-entry bookkeeping for 500 years and only just got natural capital accounting. I'd ask within that, would a business base its strategy on what's coming out of its accounts department? So accounting is very good for disambiguating data, giving you the data on which to produce a strategy. The Romeo cycle that Alistair talked about is a good model for anybody producing a strategy. It's a good model for a business making its strategy. And I wanted to ask Alistair, when he alluded on his slides and did mention the circular economy, and I just wanted to ask within that, because I came to the event on the 12th and I was very struck by the difference between somebody from Thames Water, for whom valuing nature was part of his day job and he wanted something to take off the shelf because it was only part of his day job, and somebody from Unilever who had 12 scientists working for her, who was dealing with global supply chains, whose conceptual lens wasn't even an ecosystem services approach, so needed a bit of persuasion about whether it should be an ecosystem services approach, and for whom the granularity of data was very different. And it's very difficult to come across a one-size-fits-all for somebody for whom valuing nature is part of their day job and they need to get on with other things, and somebody who's looking at global supply chains. And that brings up another issue related to the circular economy, is how far do we take these supply chains back? If we look, the International Resources Panel makes very clear, if we look on a production basis, for instance, you can see a very steeply declining trend in greenhouse gas emissions for this country. If you look at a consumption basis, it's very, very much flatter. We have a lot of ghost acres. We import a lot of our embedded raw materials. We import a lot of our embedded greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, John, yeah. Try and keep the questions short so we can get them in.
I wanted to address the issue of public goods, public money for public good, and you mentioned data as one of those, and obviously a lot of data is obtained from public money. Now, there's a very asymmetric relationship between data, money, and the private sector. So the publicly obtained data is all available to the private sector, but vice versa is not necessarily the case. And some of that, we need as much data as we can get. We need to have informed and integrated data sets for decisions. So I want to ask, really, I suppose, you about how do we encourage industry to release data back, which might be very, very expensive to obtain and almost impossible possibly for the public sector. So we want our data back, not our data, but all of the underpinning stuff was publicly funded. But for example, the North Sea oil industry.
Okay, and take a third.
Thank you. Catherine Monk, Natural Resources Wales. You've obviously emphasised that business wants a level playing field, and we know that, and it's great if we're going to work more closely towards that. And we want coherent regulation. We want national database accesses. So my question is, are you confident that the 4 countries in the UK are working together complementarily or closely enough to allow business the access it needs consistently and to avoid regional prejudice? And I particularly sort of refer to a lot of the presentations today where we inevitably say UK or Britain or England, and you know, the regulation, the 25-year plan, which is fantastic, is for England. We obviously have very similar developments in the other countries, but we do need to recognise that and avoid any unnecessary barriers for business and for the practitioners.
Okay, to give us a chance to get an answer, thank you. Yes, so we've got the issue of the circular economy, we've got the issue of asymmetric access to data, and we've got a really well put point there about the fact that environment is indeed a devolved area, so how are we going to get cohesion? Right, last chance to say something down the panel. I'll start with Charles, come towards me, and then finish up with Guy if he's got anything to say.
2 very brief points. One in response to Catherine at the end. I think Wales is doing some really interesting things, and I think this goes back to your point, Ian, on coordination, that we can learn from each other. The point on data, I think, is really interesting. And, well, I've been to Ian's comments. I've had discussion at CEO level about private sector companies releasing data. And the chief executive being really enthusiastic about it, say, yes, we must do this. And then it gets lost as it goes down. And actually real concerns at the legal department, and if this data comes out, will we be traduced by an aggressive NGO? You're probably going to be traduced anyway, so at least be traduced from the high moral, on the high moral ground. So I think there's some real technical issues in just enabling it along the way. But I think private sector holds on to more data than actually would be beneficial both for them and their sector.
Brilliant. Alistair.
To answer John's question about the circular economy, when I read the strategy, I was absolutely amazed by the potential of what could be done when it comes to reusing items within the economy rather than just throwing them away. So I thought that it was potentially a big game changer. If we could get that sorted out, that would be fantastic. It would have positive benefits upon natural capital in the sense that you wouldn't need to have so much energy going into the extraction industry, but rather you would just keep reusing the items as much as you could possibly do that. So there was a sort of feedback towards natural capital that way. I mean, you also talked about Thames Water and Unilever. I suppose if you have the finance, then you can afford to have 12 scientists dedicated to a particular subject matter. But one of the case studies that we came across, I think, was Anglia Water. Rather than building a brand new treatment plant, they, at Inglethorpe, developed a 4-riverbed system to filter water as a nature-based solution. And I think that's a fantastic example. And I think by having those examples and more of them, we can hopefully level that playing field a bit by showing that what can be done to people who do not necessarily have the resources to explore it for themselves.
So very quickly, natural capital, having been involved from start with the Ellen's Foundation, it became very clear when we talked about it in the business world that you have a general toolkit, but actually the landing of it is so different in different business models that what you want to do is train people. And the analogy I'd use about double entry bookkeeping is actually we make decisions in business on cash flow, net present value of future cash flows. The NPV analysis is we need the equivalent of a natural capital analysis that we can slot into what we know about the financials, but we are missing the other parts of the decision. And some of that is done by verbal sort of intuition at the moment, and the more precision we could apply to that, the easier it is to convince CFOs that this balances the NPV argument. So natural capital has to show up in each business in its own way and with differing levels, and it'll be very different area by area. That also applies, I think, to the data. I mean, I think a lot of businesses don't really think that they have data that will be of interest, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I think the way to do that is to sanitize it, to take out the risk point through some form of industry body. So if I was being asked from the banking point of view, I'd say, look, go to UK Finance, put a group together, what data do you want, what's useful, and how do we bring that together in an industry and anonymized way, which gives you the value of the data, but without creating the personal or firm exposure. And I think one of the things I would say is a lot of public data is also not gathered. There's a very interesting flow. We try to track all the subsidies, not just the so the water treatment subsidies, you name it, and into a location, kilometre by kilometre, to work out what public money was already going into these areas. And suddenly everyone got very cold feet because it turned into a competitive game. But hold on, Fred here is getting far more money. I didn't realise they were getting all this. And so we have to, I think, put the public and the private data together and be brave enough to talk about it. And the final point on the regional area, I completely agree. I think actually Wales and Scotland are doing some really interesting things. The land use framework in Scotland is a great example of pioneering with some real challenges. The worry I have is that we end up from a national implementation point of view with a real patchwork quilt. And so I would say, as far as possible, can we have a national framework with local application? Some of that is devolved and some of that might be, regional rather than sort of devolved nation. But I think as long as we've got a joined up bit of thinking at the principle level, you can have multiple levels of implementation. And hopefully lots of interesting experimentation.
The last word from Guy.
Yeah, I would just add, one of my previous hats was the Deputy Chair of Joint Nature Conservation Committee, and which of course is a UK body. It services central government, but also the devolved administrations. And an interesting model, I think, in the countries coming together to collaborate on evidence and data. And there are others like the CH, for example, which does that for various other aspects of natural assets. So I think building on that kind of model in terms of the evidence and data needs in ensuring that there is a shared provision across the UK is very valuable.
Excellent. Well, so I'm sorry to those that we didn't get around to the questions, but keep up the dialogue. Coffee, tea at the back there, back here at 20 past. Before you go, can we just thank again our opening panel speakers? Right, we've got to shoot. Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you for taking your seats, and welcome back to this second session, which provides an overview and a whole series of rapid presentations of relevant business impact work carried out under the Valuing Nature programme. So this session aims to champion that business relevant work done under the VNP. It's worth bearing in mind that this business relevant work under the Valuing Nature programme has been somewhat retrofitted to a programme following the launch of the programme, the announcement of opportunity. And indeed, Valuing Nature programme itself was largely designed in consultation with academia, not really co-created with business in the way that we're now seeking to co-create this new natural assets research and innovation agenda in support of business. Nevertheless, a considerable body of business relevant work has taken place under the Valuing Nature programme, and this holds important lessons really for any future research and innovation investment. So the presentations of this session will reflect on the full range of business relevant work done under the Valuing Nature programme, present a number of examples of that work. And first and foremost, perhaps, to mention is that we put in place from the outset a business interest group involving 20 to 25 business representatives. Peter Young, who chaired this group, will provide an overview of the contribution it's made over the 5 years of the programme in advising on business relevant work. Secondly, we have been running a business impact brokering programme providing tailored support to the funded health and wellbeing and tipping point projects, including scoping of relevance of research outputs from those projects to business, and helping to broker engagement with business around the more promising business relevant opportunities. And this work is ongoing, and we'll hear of some of the business relevant outcomes from a couple of these funded projects. Thirdly, the programme has run a series of business impact schools, 3 of these, 2 in London, 1 in Edinburgh, which have brought together over 60 early career researchers with business representatives to enhance mutual understanding of valuing nature research and innovation for business impact. And many of our school alumni have gone on to expand their work with business. Some have even moved into the private sector to take forward R&D within business. So we'll hear from 3 of these alumni on how attending a business impact school has influenced their work and their careers. Fourthly, a number of Valuing Nature placements have been hosted by business or by organisations working with business, and we'll hear from one of these placements. Fifth, we, under the programme, have produced a number of business relevant natural capital synthesis reports, and we'll hear from authors of 3 of these papers. The programme has also produced a number of business relevant demystifying papers, which serve to explain key concepts to non-experts. And Eche, who has led these papers, many of these papers, will provide a brief overview of some of those. The programme has covered out other business relevant work that we don't have time to present today. This includes an important paper which has reviewed land allocation models, state of play on those, and is of particular relevance, of course, to those businesses that own and manage land. A report more focused on the global agenda, the report Joining the Dots, Global Challenges in the Valuing Nature Agenda, which looked at the state of play of collaborative research between the UK and developing country institutions, and that included also analysis of business relevance of that research. And there have been at Valuing Nature's annual conferences a number of business relevant sessions, for example, on finance for nature at the 2019 conference and on investing in natural capital at the 2018 conference. It's worth recalling also that business relevant work was carried out under the precursor Valuing Nature Network 2011 to 2013, including the work that I was involved in support of Ian Cheshire and his team on the Ecosystem Markets Task Force. That's just a brief overview of what we're going to go through on this session, and I'll now hand over to Peter Young as Chair of the Business Interest Group to provide an overview of its contribution over the last 5 years. Peter.
Thank you. I'm actually mic'd up, so I don't even need to get to as far as the podium, but I'm going to retrieve the pen that I dropped first. Okay, yeah, so I'll just stand here because I've got them mic'd up, so I don't need to stand at the podium, get a bit more variety. So, yeah, the Business Interest Group, I mean, I think the first thing I'd like to say is I'm enormously grateful to the businesses who joined up from the start, because it was largely an act of faith, to be honest, but it was an indicator of the importance that this subject area had, that people were willing to come forward. And it was quite challenging at the start as well, because business needs had to be retrofitted to some extent to the research projects already chosen. And I think many of the businesses that came along, including me as chairing it, thought perhaps it was a little bit earlier in the process. But over time, it became transformational in the outputs from these projects. And I think it was transformational as well for those working on them. We had a really a good mix. And absolutely key was starting off with a cross-sector involvement. There was no dominant sector. We had water, we had insurance, we had infrastructure, consumer goods, we had retail, transport, technology, land managers, facility managers, waste and resource managers, a whole range of companies that were represented. And yet, we could have a really fruitful discussion as a group about how we could contribute and add value to this programme, and how we could actually get much better coordination between the needs of business and the way in which the researchers developed. By reaching a sort of early agreement on the common benefits, we were able to develop a lot of those themes that Guy mentioned. And I particularly want to highlight the business impact scores, the business impact brokering, the business impact reporting, and the demystifying reports, because I think all of those actually were pretty innovative. I don't think any of those would necessarily have happened if we hadn't had a business interest group who were challenging and asking whether or not these kind of outputs, which would be much more usable and accessible to the business community, could be made part of the programme. I mean, yes, we had business placements, we had conferences, we had a very good website dissemination process, and I think those are all good things, but probably that's more normal for these kind of research programmes, whereas the earlier things that I mentioned were not. And I think the other thing I'd like to say that was really important about the Business Interest Group is we were able to keep, I think, good connection, but not at a too burdensome level, you know. And it's interesting that even without that huge commitment, meeting annually, some sort of dialogue in between, some events when people are involved, and then a really good contribution from business in terms of the other activities, particularly, I mean, the business impact scores could not have taken place if it hadn't had the time given. Now, it's interesting, if you get your sort of accountant's hat on, the actual process of the business interest group and the things that flowed out of it represented hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of effort actually by business, although most of it was more in time and in hosting meetings in kind rather than actually in finance, but a very substantial additional value unlocked for the programme. And something I think is quite important to be able to make tangible. And I think that raises one question going forward. When you're actually collaborating in this way, it's important that everybody's contribution is properly valued. We're talking about the challenge of valuing nature, but actually there's a challenge in actually valuing research contribution too. I think it's important we get an even playing field for that. But I don't want to spend up a lot of time on this. There's a lot of stuff on the website. You can read these outputs. You can see how we operated. For me, the single highlight, and we're going to hear next, I think, from some of the individuals who are involved, was reaching over 60 early-stage researchers through the business impact schools. When we sort of advertised the first, we were overwhelmed with interest. It actually resulted in people coming forward who were working on existing PhD or postdoctorate research, which we weren't even aware of in the programme, which was highly relevant. And the willingness to engage from both sides brought real benefits to all parties in terms of the communication and the collaborations that then resulted. And in a way, that sort of leads in, I think, back to Guy for this sort of this session, which is actually to give you a feel for how that collective impact was felt throughout the programme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So we'll now then go into this series of rapid presentations, examples of business relevant work under the programme. We've allowed a maximum of 5 minutes for each of our presenters, so quite a challenge. Bill here will be holding up red cards, or yellow cards, or whatever, white cards, to allow people to know they've got a minute left, and we'll be keeping people quite strictly to time. First up, we've got Mark Reed, who actually is not here in the room, but he's prepared a video for us, which we'll now show. So Mark Reed from Newcastle University. The advantage of not having him in the room is he'll definitely keeps time. So Mark led one of the tipping point projects, and he's going to give us his take on business relevant output from this project. So if our technicians could kindly load the video, thank you.
Hello, my name is Mark Reed and I'm a Professor of Socio-Technical Innovation at Newcastle University and Principal Investigator of the Peatland Tipping Points project that has sought to understand how peatlands around the UK might respond to climate change and changes in policy and how we manage these environments that might lead to abrupt and potentially irreversible changes or tipping points in the services that we as society get from these environments. Our most important carbon stores under our feet is in peat bogs, not in our trees. In the UK, they're important for water quality, for flood risk alleviation, biodiversity, etc. But the problem is that the majority of them have been degraded in various ways, whether that be through wildfire or through drainage. And as a result, that is a cost to society. Fixing that problem is both important and expensive. It's important because peat bogs are part of the land use sector, which is a problem in terms of the UK meeting its Paris Agreement commitments to reduce our emissions to net zero. And it's expensive because many of these environments are really quite remote. So to raise our game to that challenge, we've been looking at how we might blend public and private finance using the Peatland Code that enables private investors to invest in peatland restoration for the climate and other benefits that you get. Now, the Peatland Code sat alongside the Woodland Carbon Code, our other regional carbon market in the UK, and something called Landscape Enterprise Networks in DEFRA's 25-year environment plan. And as a team, we've been looking at how we might be able to integrate these three private ecosystem service markets. Now, landscape enterprise networks work quite differently to these two regional carbon markets. They were developed originally by 3Keel with Nestle, although this is an open source mechanism, and there are a number of these now across the UK that don't involve Nestle. What we're trying to do now is to integrate mitigation of climate change and a bunch of other environmental benefits on farm through on-farm interventions with woodland planting and with peatland restoration now at a landscape scale. Landscape enterprise networks also pool investment, looking at a range of corporations, businesses that have dependencies on natural capital across a landscape, and then to pool that investment so we get over the free rider problem where people say, well, why would I invest when my competitors will benefit from them? And it's surprising the level of investment that this is attracting and the level of interest that we're getting in this as an approach now across the UK. What for me is really exciting about this is that this is moving out of the box of corporate social responsibility or CSR and into a box which is all about reducing risk. So the majority of these companies have a variety of climate-related risks on their risk register and are thinking about creative ways in which they might be able to reduce those risks, whether those be risks to their assets or to their supply chains, etc. And so what we're offering through these integrated landscape scale projects are a range of different interventions that might reduce those risks. And at the same time get a win for the landowners, the farmers, because they've now diversified their income to be able to get money for ecosystem services alongside the commodities that they might traditionally sell. And of course there is the benefit for the environment as well. We now have more resilient landscapes that are more able to adapt to some of the threats from climate change, whilst actually tackling the underpinning problem by creating landscapes that are absorbing carbon where possible and certainly reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And as a result of those interventions now, we have these more resilient, sustainable landscapes that are providing benefits not only to the people who live and work on them and the companies who are investing, but to society as well. So a triple win for business, for landowners and farmers, and for the environment. Let's think more holistically, if we can, about what role business might play in the future of climate mitigation across the UK in the land use sector.
So many thanks to Mark for putting that together. So that was an example from one of the tipping point projects, and focused around peatland tipping points and the opportunities there to create business investment in restoration of peatlands. We'll move on to one of the health and wellbeing projects. Jack Benton of Manchester University will explain to us some of the business relevant output under GEAR. So over to you, Jack.
So it's very difficult to quantify the benefits that nature can offer for human well-being in a robust yet inexpensive way using the existing measures that we currently have available. Therefore, there's a lack of evidence around which nature-based interventions offer the best value for improving human well-being. To address this issue, we've developed Mohawk, a robust yet inexpensive tool that can quantify the potential benefits that nature might offer for human well-being by using direct observations of people's behaviour. We developed this tool based on the 5 ways to well-being, which are 5 evidence-based behaviours that are known to be important for improving our well-being. And we found that we can actually reliably observe 3 of these 5 behaviours, which are measured using our Mohawk observation tool. So number 1, be active, so physical activity behaviour. Number 2, connect behaviours, so social interactions. And number 3, take notice behaviour, so people consciously appreciating the environment around them. The Mohawk also assesses people's characteristics, including gender, age and ethnicity. So what we get from the Mohawk is quite simply counts of people, counts of these 3 wellbeing behaviours and counts of people's characteristics. So the picture seems to be cut off a bit there, but to demonstrate how we've been using the Mohawk, I'm just going to talk about one case study where we've been working with businesses like Peel Land and Property to try and demonstrate the potential wellbeing impact of nature-based interventions by using the Mohawk. So in this case study with Peel, we have evaluated and used the Mohawk along one of their canals in Salford, where they made several green space improvements. So we used Mohawk to collect data at this site at baseline before the improvements were made, which you can't see on this slide. And then we collected Mohawk data at 3 separate follow-ups after the improvements were made. And we also collected Mohawk data at 2 separate canal sites in Bolton and Wigan, which acted as sort of comparison or control sites because there were no improvements that were happening at those 2 sites. And what we can see here is just one of several outputs that Mohawk can offer. So in this graph, we simply see just the average observed number of people that were observed using these 3 canal sites at baseline, and then again at each of the 3 follow-ups. So what we can see is that at the 2 control sites where no improvements were made, we see that canal usage stayed relatively stable over time, whereas at the intervention site where the improvements happened, we see quite a big increase in canal usage after the improvements were implemented. And we saw similar increases for each of the 3 wellbeing behaviours as well. So this case study therefore demonstrates how Mohawk can provide quite an easy way to sort of quantify the positive wellbeing impacts of nature-based interventions on the local community. So why should people be interested in using Mohawk? Well, we've just seen how Mohawk can demonstrate the social value of nature in a way that is relatively easy to understand. So it's likely to be relevant for investors and developers like Peel to sort of local and regional government authorities. Mohawk is also relatively inexpensive to deploy and relatively inexpensive to deploy consistently over time as well. Mohawk is user-friendly, given that we're only counting people and counting people's behaviour, so most people would be able to use this tool. And therefore we can get sort of lay people or practitioners, for instance, to use this tool with even as little as a day's training. Mohawk is unobtrusive, given that we're not interfering with people who are using the urban environment, so we're not relying on people to actively respond to surveys or input data into an app, for instance. Mohawk is reliable and valid. This has been shown in over 600 hours of data across 34 different sites. And Mohawk has not only been used along canals, but it's been used in pocket parks, in town squares, along tree-lined residential streets. And therefore, there's no reason why it can't be used in a wide variety of urban environments. So we're hoping that Mohawk is offering a robust and inexpensive method for generating wellbeing impact evidence in relation to the urban environments. If you are interested in potentially using Mohawk, please do get in touch or come and have a chat with me today. I also just finally wanted to finish up on some free mapping tools that the Gaia project has also produced. So if you are interested in learning a bit more about these mapping tools, please do go on the website, or I'm sure there'll be a couple of representatives from the Gaia project next door at one of the tables. But thank you for your time.
Many thanks, Jack. And of course, government has very significant house building targets over the next over the term of this government, and that's a tool that perhaps will be of very much interest to Ministry of Housing, who we've spoken to over the last few weeks about their interest in ensuring that natural asset issues are integrated into that house building effort. Okay, next up we have our alumni from our Business Impact schools. And first up is Prue Addison, who many of you I'm sure will know, now at BBOUT, but previously, or still perhaps linked to, University of Oxford, and done a lot of work with the business community. So over to you, Prue.
Okay. Hi everyone. As Guy said, I'm Prue Addison and I work at the Wildlife Trust, and I'm a research associate at the University of Oxford. And so in 2016 I attended the first Valuing Nature Business Impact School. And these pictures, I took both of these pictures during my time at the Business Impact School, and it really highlights the contrasting venues that the organisers arranged for us, from the heart of London City at Willis Towers Watson out to the green open spaces of Windsor Great Park. And so back then, when I attended the Business Impact School, I was an optimistic early career researcher, conservation scientist, assuming that, like me, surely all businesses are doing good things for the environment just because they're intrinsically motivated to do so, because it's the right thing to do. Well, I was wrong. The Business Impact School helped me realise really quickly the many and varied motivations for businesses to value nature and to integrate that into their decisions. So from operational motivations to improve their operational efficiencies, financial incentives because lenders are telling businesses, you must do this, you must do good things for the environment, for legal and regulatory requirements, for brand differentiation, reputational management, and also just because shareholders or board members say so. Now, of course, this audience, you all know this. You know these many and varied motivations, but I can assure you most scientists don't realise this. And understanding why businesses are motivated and what they want to do in regards to valuing nature and integrating the environment into their decision-making is critical for scientists to understand. And so this was my biggest learning from the school. And so since then, I've made it my business to learn the language of business, to be able to communicate with them, build trust, identify opportunities for collaboration, and to identify opportunities to influence them. And so since then, I've had a keener eye on the opportunities to achieve research impact with businesses. So in 2016, when I attended the Business Impact School, I also started my NERC Knowledge Exchange Fellowship at the University of Oxford. And I planned at that time to work with a couple of businesses to develop biodiversity metrics for business. In the end, I worked with an ecosystem of collaborators with the intention of undertaking applied and relevant research that would influence businesses and help them account for biodiversity in their business decisions. So in the end, I, as a conservation scientist, worked with chartered and academic accountants, NGOs in business and biodiversity programs, government agencies, and some businesses as well. So what I learnt from my 3-year fellowship then was that to achieve real research impact, we really obviously need to work across disciplines and to address the challenges that businesses are wanting to work on. This is not about what researchers are interested in. This is about helping on the really applied side of research. And so this research is really applied, and I think it is actually really difficult to keep it within universities. And there are many people like me that often end up falling out of academia and into the real world to be able to keep on doing the work that we do. So now I work with the Wildlife Trust, and I now lead a large team, and we're developing on-the-ground conservation programs in and around Oxford. And so I think that there is a really big role for NGOs in this space of valuing nature and working with businesses. And so at the Wildlife Trust, I'm getting to work on some really cool, innovative practice now around sustainable finance and around how we upscale public and private finance to actually invest in natural capital in the UK. So I'm now keen, working on the outside, to bridge the gap back to academic research to actually help draw out really super applied research that can help progress the whole field and ultimately help environmental accountability for businesses.
Very many thanks, Prue, and we need a lot more people like you oiling the wheels. Next up is Eleanor Tu, who's now with the Forestry Commission, which I think in many respects we can count as a business. And Ellie also was at our first school in 2016. Ellie.
Yes, good morning. So I also attended the Business Impact School with Prue in 2016 during the first year of my PhD. And since then, I've now completed my PhD, and I'm working for Forestry England, which is the land management branch of Forestry Commission. I'm managing their forest resilience programme, and I'm also now an academic visitor at the University of Cambridge. So the Business Impact School was a couple of really exciting and thought-provoking days, the type of experience that I have never before nor since experienced within the academic research world. Our cohort was mainly PhD students and some postdocs. We were expected to dress in business attire and attend meetings in a skyscraper in central London. We heard from organisations like Nestle and the National Grid about how they're incorporating valuing nature concepts into their business. And we discussed how we could make our own research much more impactful and applicable to the business community, and we had training from experts. So there are a number of lessons and impressions that stayed with me from that school, which influenced my subsequent research and career choices. My PhD evaluated ecosystem service delivery from UK forestry, and I was a case student with Forestry England as my research partner. So like many conservation scientists, I've been motivated by the intrinsic value of nature, but I knew that to maximise the value of my research, I really wanted to understand how I could communicate it to Forestry England, my partner, in business and economic terms. Now, as a young researcher, my lack of experience of the business world made it seem like this really intimidating and impenetrable place. So the first and most valuable lesson that I learned was that business really isn't so scary after all, and it's mostly just about talking a different language. And that important lesson that I learned then has really helped me, and I've since grown hugely in confidence in having those discussions. So now in my current role, I can hold my own in discussions about supply chains or income revenue, and I understand how to argue the case for nature much more effectively. So, as I mentioned, we heard from a variety of different organisations about how they're integrating valuing nature concepts into business. And I remember that some of those organisations were distinctly more impressive than others. So some of them really got it, but others were simply tagging it on in what seemed like an afterthought. And clearly misunderstanding of natural capital concepts is common. And although many organisations recognise it and they want to do something about it, they often don't know how to implement it effectively. That really helped me to focus my PhD by using science to generate practical business and land use recommendations. And it also encouraged me, like Prue, to look outside of academia for a career in a role that allows me to use my scientific expertise to help integrate the value of nature into everyday business decisions. And finally, I made a brilliant network of friends and colleagues, and I've bumped into the people I met on that business impact school so much more than people I've met at any other kind of conference or event. And whenever I see their name attributed to a piece of work, I always know that it's going to be interesting. And I think that's a great credit to the organisers and the selectors of the school. So finally, we've been asked to briefly reflect on our own ideas for next steps for the research and innovation community. And in the time available, I'm just going to offer one suggestion, which has some clear synergies with what we've already been discussing this morning. So clearly, many organisations want to integrate natural capital concepts into decisions, but the decision support tools are, in my experience, simultaneously too complex and too simple. They're often far too complicated in that you need to put highly specialised data in a highly detailed way, often with some kind of degree in coding to help you. But at the other end, the outputs are often far too simplistic. So, for example, most models might return you a value for a generic woodland category, but they'll fail to distinguish between conifers and broadleaves, let alone any kind of further species. Land managers need the tools that's going to help them to make much more tailored decisions. So, for example, what tree species should we be using in all this new tree planting that's going to be going on? So we need to find that Goldilocks of decision support tools that's easy to use, but gives sophisticated outputs. So good luck. But thank you for listening. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank Guy and the rest of the organisers of that Business Impact School. It was a brilliant experience. Thank you.
Thank you for the compliments, Ellie, and it's very diplomatic of you not to mention which companies it were that are impressive and which were less impressive at the Impact School. Okay, next we have Gemma James, also at the first school, and now running Building with Nature. Gemma.
Hello everyone, I'm Gemma Jerome, Dr. Gemma Jerome now, how exciting. So I attended the Business Impact School in 2016, and in the next 5 minutes I'm going to give a very brief overview of the impact of attending that school and the resultant engagement I had with the business community and how that shaped my career choices. And then finally I'm going to give some reflections on how decision making and research and innovation can help businesses integrate natural assets into their business models. Okay. So in 2015, I was employed by a charitable organisation, Wildlife Trust, and I was employed also by the University of West of England, and that was as a researcher. So the intention was to bring my knowledge and research experience to help innovate a new product to meet an identified market need. In 2020, now, I'm the director of a new national organisation which manages the delivery of this innovation, this new product, and I'm in charge of continuing to innovate that product and make sure that we continue to meet the market need. So that's the journey I've been on in the last 4 years. In terms of what the impact of the Value in Nature Programme Business School was, it really helped me to stress the importance of engagement with the business community. So as a researcher, you can often sit in your legendary ivory tower and just create solutions, not in a vacuum, but without that real kind of cut and thrust of what's actually happening on the ground. So the experience of the school really helped to highlight the role that keeping that engagement with the end user can play to ensure that research really meets the needs of the end user, of any products and services that arise from new research findings and insight. So essentially, that helped to shape the next couple of years of my role within this organisation to develop a product. So we started customer requirements testing at the beginning, rather than developing something in isolation and in a lab, essentially, and then bringing it out. Stakeholder engagement was an incredibly important part of the product innovation process. And I wanted to stress this important aspect of active listening. And if you want your product to be designed in a way that then it's actually going to meet the needs of your end user, it really is that two-way knowledge exchange between you as the researcher, you don't know everything, and the people who you're hoping will use the product you're developing. In terms of how it impacted on my career choices, I think this is a critical insight for me from the business school. Whereas once I may have stayed in research and became a member of a higher education institution, I was actually offered a full-time lecturer post, and my PhD supervisor was absolutely gobsmacked when I told him I turned it down. But that's the holy grail, what do you mean? I now understand the potential impact of bringing an inquisitive and questioning mind to a business setting, and how the results and impact of that mindset can play an incredibly important role in actually changing the world, which is why most people go into research in the first place. So in terms of my career choices, I think it's important insight for me to share with you that what the school helped me understand is you can have knowledge, but it's useless if you can't effectively communicate it. I know there are really, really good people in the research and knowledge education sector who can do that, but it's just as important when you're somebody with research skill set working in business. And then in terms of skills and training, you really need to target your skills and training to your customer, and that can really result in change and influence in the market. In terms of these photos, just really quickly, so the top one is me delivering some training to stakeholders from planning and development sector in Cornwall. So just showing how much you can really have fun with bringing new ideas through. You can make that often scary process into something that's actually a fun process. And the second one is the first cohort of approved assessors that I trained up to be the delivery agents of the benchmark that we actually created. And it's about developing high quality green infrastructure for residential and commercial development. Final slide. In terms of the lessons for integration, natural assets into business models. So I just wanted to really quickly suggest what I've called the 5 pointers for framing this journey as a problem to solution journey. So I think this is building on the things that came through for me at the Business Impact School. So key thing for me was language. It's really, really important that you kind of drop your nomenclature that suits a research setting and actually understand how to talk about the key things you're trying to convey in a business community in the right way so people actually understand what you're talking about. So rather than talking about costs, you talk about investment, really shaping the message to fit the needs of your delivery partners. If you want to innovate, then you have to bring people on that journey with you. In terms of multiple benefits, it's recognizing that there are different kinds of benefits, and you're asking different delivery agents to be interested at different stages of the journey. So immediate versus long term. In terms of who pays for the uplift in value, often in a development setting, you're asking for that capital investment up front, and actually the benefits that come back to society, public goods and services, are much longer term. So those wider benefits to society, creating a narrative that makes sense to the business community, those people who are paying for the new infrastructure, you have to find a way to make that message make sense to them. In terms of building confidence as well, I think this continues to be a really big theme for me. So often I go into a room, and when I work with developers every day, but they're often perceived by people in the third sector, charitable and environment sector as the bad guys. Are they bad guys, or are they agents of change that you just haven't engaged with yet? So businesses, I believe, are really trying to understand all the risks and opportunities associated with protecting and enhancing the environment, and it's our job to actually help them do that better, more effectively, more consistently. Partnership and collaboration. So the more that academics and practitioners from the voluntary sector can help them do that, then we got a win-win situation from that. So it's really important to kind of enter a room in that spirit of goodwill, partnership and collaboration, rather than I'm here to tell you what the answer is and what you're doing wrong at the moment. I think it's that two-way all the time. And then finally, in terms of defining key opportunities, so making sure that the opportunities are framed in a way that businesses can understand. So lots of talk at the moment about biodiversity net gain. How do you frame that in a way that actually prioritises and highlights the benefits for everyone? So it's not just a compliance issue, but actually there's a chance here for real innovation. And that's all I had to say. Thank you.
You've probably noticed, and I'm at fault here, that our opening plenary was rather old, grey and distinctly male. And we're now getting a new generation through with some leading young women who are probably our hope for the future. So glad we're slightly redressing the balance in this session. Having said that, next up we have Colm. We have Colm Bell from Liverpool John Moores University, one of our placements, who is hosted by Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, which of course works very closely with businesses around these kinds of issues. So over to you, Colm.
Hi everybody. Yeah, as Guy said, so I'm a senior lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University, but as I also mentioned before, I'm chair of the Liverpool City Region Natural Capital Working Group, and I'm also currently leading on an Elmwood's project as well. So hopefully I'm one of those academics that are still in academia that are bridging back the other way into wider society. So as Guy said, yeah, I've been asked to talk about my placement that was with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. That was a placement I did back in 2017. And essentially the aim of that placement was to work with the businesses within the Natural Capital Impact Group of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. And what we were doing was we were talking about with them, so remember this is back in 2017 before we had the 25-year plan and before we had ELMS or the agricultural bill released. So we were talking to them about getting their views on how natural capital might look within post-Brexit agricultural policy. So what I'm going to do today is present some of the results from that, but also talk to you guys how it's kind of formed my thinking around business and natural capital, but particularly around private investment coming from business into natural capital within rural areas. So as already been pointed out today, we now know that we've got the agricultural bill, and with the agricultural bill we've got the environmental land management system. So we know that government's going to put some public money into public goods that will be paid to farmers and other land owners. But what we don't, and we're assuming that some of those public goods will include natural capital. But what we don't know is how much money is going to come through, and how much that might be compared to CAP. Whether that's farmers are going to have less money available to them, and is that going to be enough money to achieve some of the goals that we've set out within the 25-year environment plan? So we already know about one source of funding that's going to come from the private sector, and that's the mandatory investment that's going to be driven by mandatory net gain. But then there's the other aspect of businesses investing for business return, and we know that there are some examples of that out there. But those are still quite rare. So the examples that Nestle paying farmers to improve the resilience within their supply chains, lots of discussion and work through things like the Lens projects, looking at water companies investing in both water quality and water quantity. And then there's various discussions around infrastructure and insurance companies also investing. But one of the questions is how, but at the moment these examples are still quite rare, and from the businesses that we spoke to within the Cambridge group, there was some variation in terms of the likely levels of investment that business thought would potentially happen. So I guess the question then lies is how large a role we expect business to play beyond that investment that's driven by the regulatory sector. On top of that, we then have the other effects of Brexit. So the other thing we did was take the interviews that we did with the businesses and use that as a steer to develop a number of scenarios around what post-Brexit agricultural policy might look like and the impacts of what that might be. And so depending on, obviously we now know Brexit's happening, but depending on the trade outcome and the level of payments that farmers receive, that's going to have a number of different effects. And I won't go into those in detail because you can read our report to find out more about those. But essentially there are 4 main outcomes that may happen. So a decline within the agricultural sector, a need for the farmers to increase farm performance and productivity, potentially both of the above, depending on where you are as a farmer and what sort of farmer you are, or potentially little change. If we are likely to see a decline within the agricultural sector, then we might want to look at investment within natural capital around things like carbon, water quality, flood control, and driving the tourist industry to try and promote growth within the rural economies and rural sectors. If we see a potential need for an increase in farm performance, we want farmers to carry out that improvement within their farm performance or production, but do that in a sustainable way. So we might want to invest around natural capital to do that, so around soil quality, improving soil quality and things like that. So the question that kind of our research posed was that can we achieve that through just the environmental land management system, so through the public money and through the private money that's driven by legislation, or what is the role of private investment in this? So if we think about a number of those ecosystem services that I've highlighted, those are highly relevant to a number of business sectors in terms of agribusiness, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of tourism. So if we want business to start investing within natural capital, then how do we start to encourage them to do that? So again, this is one of the things we talk to the businesses about, and the businesses highlighted that investment will be driven by return. And there's increasing academic literature that's talks about being green, being better for the bottom line. But it's not as simple as potentially businesses investing in some types of natural capital and the public sector investing in other types of natural capital. It's very difficult to disentangle the different beneficiaries that you get from ecosystem services and natural capital. And so it's going to be potentially more complicated than that. And also what return looks like for different businesses may look slightly different. The other question is then should we start establishing legislative frameworks to help support private investment? So that might help to mediate and support the interactions between the businesses and the landowner. And there's been a certain amount of writing that's been done on that by people like Green Alliance and the Aldersgate Group. And that, again, reflected back on what the businesses told us. The businesses highlighted that co-investors and delivery partners are going to be really important to be able to implement this. The other question that we started to think about was, should government incentivise? We've looked at some of those already today, and things like green bonds has already come up. And the businesses we talked to indicated that, yes, it would be beneficial to do that, to at least kickstart the market. These markets are still quite immature, and things like this could help to drive that forward. There's potentially lessons we can learn from social value investment and the way government has supported that sector as well. And then there's another aspect in terms of natural capital accounting and reporting. So the businesses we spoke to indicated that they were keen to set natural capital goal outcomes alongside government. And there's that question of how mandatory do we want natural capital accounting to become. So there's already some movement towards that in terms of the carbon sector, but how we might expand that and how business might interact with us within that journey. And then the last point I wanted to make, the last point that kind of came out of our work was this issue around free riding. So free riding is essentially the issue you get is if you get one business investing, but because we're dealing largely with public goods, then other businesses can then benefit from that without investing themselves. There's also the issue of businesses potentially free riding on public investment as well. So for me, this is one of the key issues that we need to resolve if we're going to get a healthy sector being created in terms of private investment within natural capital, beyond the large progressive organisations that are doing it now. They're interacting with things like the Lens Project. We're going to start getting SMEs and small businesses starting to think about this, and we need to think about that free riding issue to try and resolve that. Yeah, thanks very much.
Many thanks, Colm. So we're going to move on to 3 rapid presentations on our synthesis reports coming out of the programme. So first we have Victoria James Bassett from the Pentland Centre for Sustainability in Business at Lancaster University on soil natural capital valuation needs for agribusiness. Victoria.
So hi everyone, thanks for having me here today. I'm just going to give a brief overview of our synthesis report on soil natural capital valuation for agribusiness, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Lancaster University working with Jess Davies. So this was a short project back in 2018, and I wanted to thank the Value in Nature programme for providing funding for this work. And we worked in partnership with an international agri-food business called Olam, who operate from seed to shelf in a range of products, particularly cocoa, coffee, nuts and spices. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. So first of all, soils are valuable. They provide a whole range of ecosystem services across food provision, but also water regulation and quality, and climate regulation and biodiversity support. And various studies have tried to quantify the value of soil-derived ecosystem services. And I don't want you to take too much away from these values, rather than just pointing out that the soils are valuable. These values have a large uncertainty, and they're largely variable between space and place. Despite their value, though, soils are degrading. Around a third of our soils globally are classified as moderately or severely degraded, and that area increases at an alarming rate every year. We're seeing issues such as erosion, compaction, salt issues, and ultimately desertification. And the issues surrounding soil degradation is that when soils degrade, they don't provide ecosystem services in the same way, and we lose these benefits. And soil degradation issues are estimated to cost us society a significant amount of money every year. So looking at agribusinesses, particularly companies like Olam, soils underpin their business model. They're a fundamental part of the supply chain. And so we worked with Olam to evaluate, in this project we evaluate existing frameworks for natural capital valuation, discussed with Olam needs for valuation of natural capital frameworks within their business, and then looked at the sort of how those existing frameworks met their needs. And we identified sort of 5 key areas where businesses such as Olam could benefit from natural capital valuation methods. The first thing is identifying business risk and resilience. So as I said, soils underpin agribusinesses, but also other businesses. And so natural capital provides a means for identifying dependencies within the supply chain for businesses. It can reduce costs, not just so operating costs. So whilst sustainable management can not just whilst promoting investment in natural capital assets, it can reduce operating costs for the business, provide an increased product value, particularly in a society now as we've been hearing about increased awareness of environmental concerns, and consumers value those sustainable practices. Co-benefits, so these ecosystem services have both private value to the business, but also public benefits, and identifying those public benefits can also have private value to the business. And then in terms of corporate and social responsibilities, businesses have sort of a responsibility to look after the environment. So ultimately, natural capital is key to the long-term sustainable business models for these agribusinesses. So as I said, working with Olam, we identified 3 key areas or requirements from a natural capital framework. The first one, as I said, is understanding risk, so understanding the dependencies of the business on natural capital assets. And a key way to do this is to understand what we termed the whole pathway of natural capital and ecosystem service provision. So what I mean is, whilst we're looking at the benefits and ecosystem services from which they're derived and the natural capital stocks, but also understanding how those natural capital stocks can change as a result of changing drivers, management and supporting processes. Building a strong business case. So obviously in an agri-food setting, one of the primary considerations is crop productivity, but to build a strong business case, if we consider a multiple range of soil ecosystem services and benefits, particularly across carbon sequestration and climate regulation and water regulation, this can help promote a change in practice. And differentiating between benefits, so as I said about those with private and public value, and acknowledging that those with public benefits can have private value to the business. And then finally, we just identified evidence gaps, as we've been hearing about, and whilst we appreciate there are evidence gaps, we do have enough scientific evidence and tools to be able to make a start of understanding of how to quantify natural capital in soils. But we do need to consider this wide range of soil ecosystem services rather than focusing individually on specifically food productivity. And we need to understand this dynamic representation of natural capital stocks and how they can change over time. And ultimately, mechanisms that allow, as we've been hearing, closer partnership between business and science, and mechanisms that allow this kind of co-creation of science. And our report is available on the Valuing Nature website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria. And I know we've got a number of food supply chain companies and land-owning companies in the room, so I'm sure that's of interest to you in particular. We'll have next Emma Rotheroe, who is from Sheffield Institute for International Development, and her synthesis report is on the natural capital of floodplains as a function of land use. So very pertinent at this time of immense flooding in the UK. Emma.
Thank you. Yes, hi. My name is Emma Rotheroe. I'm a project manager for a partnership organisation called the Floodplain Meadows Partnership. We're hosted at the Open University, and we are a group of academics and conservation practitioners, farmers and other research organisations who all have a very specific interest in species-rich ancient floodplain meadows. We were fortunate enough to secure this grant from the Valuing Nature programme, which gave us an amount of money to undertake a literature review on the natural capital of floodplains and in the context of land uses. This literature review showed us that 70% of English and Welsh floodplains are in some form of intensive agriculture, and that's a mix of either improved grassland or arable and horticulture, as compared to only 11% of our floodplains that are in some form of semi-natural habitat land use, covered by fen, marsh, swamp, neutral grasslands or broad-leaved woodlands. 42% of our rivers are no longer in connection to our floodplains through over-deepening, development and flood alleviation schemes. We went on to look at these figures in the context of what ecosystem services those land uses delivered using the terminology in the National Ecosystem Assessment. This graph shows the figures for English floodplains only. So you can see the 70% of improved grassland and arable and horticulture land use. And those land uses that cover the most floodplain areas deliver the fewest number of ecosystem services compared to those land uses that have the smallest area of coverage in English floodplains, which deliver the largest number of services. And this is a mismatch in our view in terms of what society could benefit from changes in land use in floodplains. Our interest particularly is in the neutral grassland little pie at the bottom, which is where floodplain meadows sit. But this literature review also looked at woodlands, fens, marshes and swamps. As part of this review, we found this very interesting case study that the Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire Wildlife Trust had undertaken in 2017. They wanted to look at the costed service provision of a nature reserve that they've owned for 30 years before and after restoration from an intensive arable farm to an extensive agricultural nature reserve. This is a nature reserve in the Thames Valley. They bought it in the 1980s and they converted it from all the arable land went over into lowland meadow, floodplain meadow. They added in some wetland habitats and did some tree planting and hedge planting as part of the conversion into a nature reserve. And in 2017, they employed some consultants to look at costing ecosystem service provision. And this is what they found. After 30 years, if they had stayed as an arable farm and a commercial system, they would have seen £1.2 million worth of ecosystem service benefits, as compared to £8.2 million worth of ecosystem service benefits as it existed under a nature reserve scenario. And the figures are taken from various sources in the literature that the company that undertook this consultancy work had found, and they're reasonably widely used as far as I can tell. But you can see the big gains in water regulation, climate regulation, that came from converting the arable to lowland meadow. natural flood management, wildlife gains, and outdoor recreation and health benefits. The farm is still managed as a productive system because it's managed as a meadow, but it doesn't have as much production as it does under an arable farm. And I think this is a really interesting study to show what could happen if we converted more of our arable floodplains into these kind of lower intensive land uses in floodplains. As part of our literature review, specifically looking at soil carbon, we found some figures to show what these different land uses could store in terms of carbon. And you can see, obviously, the values range, but you've got arable and horticultural at the bottom. We have some unpublished data, which we're currently bringing together, which specifically looks at floodplain meadows in the UK, which shows that their carbon storage is very significantly greater than many of the other land uses in floodplains. And this is because they're very ancient systems, so you've got a very deep profile. Species-rich systems store more carbon than species-poor ones. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to fly the flag for grasslands in the carbon discussion that's going on at the moment. Everybody talks about trees and peatlands as well. And Mark Reed mentioned the grassland, not a grassland carbon code, he mentioned the peatland carbon code, and there's a woodland carbon code, but I don't think there's a grassland carbon code, and there really ought to be, because these are very important carbon storage systems. Finally, we would really like to work with the business community on developing this area of research. We'd like to look at the effectiveness of floodplain restoration in reducing flood risk and maximising carbon storage. We would like to work with the insurance industry to look at evidence and data that would help in floodplain insurance systems. We would obviously like to research more the complex ecological and biogeochemical processes in floodplains, which is one of the reasons why there are multiple benefits to be gained from semi-natural and natural floodplain systems. And we would also like to look more at valuing species-rich habitats, and in particular species-rich grasslands. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. And what we heard from DEFRA this morning about public payment for public goods coming down the line, I'm sure many lowland farmers might be interested in the wealth of ecosystem services that might be valid for receipt of such public payments in lowland flood meadows. We now have a video, one more video, this time from Rose Pritchard of Sheffield Institute for International Development, on early adoption of natural capital in the private sector. So this was another of the Value Nature synthesis reports. So could you kindly start that for us, please?
There's no video.
Ah, okay. I'm sorry about that. We will have to skip it. A hiccup in the provision of the files. So we will move on in that case, and apologies to Rose for not having lined that up. I'll tell you what it is. It's a slide with voiceover. Is it possible to play? It should play the voiceover, I think, on the slide. Are you able to play the voice on that slide?
One second.
Thank you.
And I'm going to give a very quick overview of a report I put together with Dan van der Horst at the University of Edinburgh in 2018 for the Valuing Nature Network, where we reviewed the current status of natural capital assessment among private sector organisations. So private sector engagement with natural capital approaches is still quite a new thing, as I'm sure you're all very much aware. And our interest was in businesses who were early adopters of natural capital accounting, also including those businesses who'd engaged with adjacent approaches like environmental profit and loss assessments. We were interested in why businesses were picking up these approaches, which types of businesses were early adopters of the approach, and what kinds of impacts were being observed as a result of using these approaches. For this latter question, we were interested in benefits to business, but also in some of the bigger claims, often made around natural capital assessment, that there will also be benefits emerging for environment and for society. So to answer these questions, we reviewed publicly available case study material from early adopting businesses, both written by businesses themselves, for example, as part of corporate sustainability reports, and also secondary materials from groups like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Now, we're very aware that this literature is a partial sample, because we know that there is material which has been produced which isn't publicly available. So we present these very much as preliminary findings. Our objective here is hopefully to inspire more research, as opposed to pretending that we've already figured out the totality of the story, the totality of what's going on here. In terms of the who, what we found was a skew towards large multinationals headquartered in Europe and North America, and towards businesses in the materials sector. In terms of the why, we find a lot of the reasons you would expect. For example, better understanding of natural capital impacts and dependencies, better understanding of natural capital risks to enable strategic planning. But also important was that we saw lots of narratives around innovation and around the reputational benefits of adopting a pioneering approach. And this does inevitably raise a question about whether the early popularity of the approach is going to persist when this shine is worn off, and how you can maintain this initial appeal for longer-term impact. And this leads on to that question about impact, which is, of course, one of the themes of this session. The primary impacts we saw reported by businesses at this stage were reputational, and there were also benefits reported for communication within companies and with wider stakeholder networks. And those are all really good, really worthwhile things, particularly the communication benefits of this as a tool. But what we didn't see just yet was evidence of meaningful behaviour changes towards increased sustainability. And there are potentially really good explanations for this. Firstly, that the approach is still in its early stages and might need a bit more time to mature. It's also totally plausible that changes are happening but haven't been shared because there is no requirement for external disclosure. You've also got a classic counterfactual problem where you don't know what would have happened without the use of the natural capital approach. But my feeling is that if this approach is to enable building of bridges across boundaries, and beyond those who are already convinced by natural capital concepts, natural capital approaches, there is a need for proofs of concept and for illustrations that really substantial changes are occurring as a result of the adoption of natural capital valuations. So those were our findings. We have looked at things quite critically. It is a critical analysis, but our objective by doing so is to be constructive and to facilitate hopefully improvements in the approach. I would really welcome any feedback, particularly any examples of impact case studies or success stories which we might have missed. We'd really value anything which might refute the idea that there haven't been major impacts that we didn't capture in our initial analysis. So if there's anything that you would like to share, it would be great if you could get in touch with me using the email address on the slide. And thank you very much again for the opportunity to contribute today.
So many thanks to Rose for that. I'm sure there may be some businesses in the room who'd like to refute some of her critical findings, so please do get in touch with her. Well, now, final presentation is from Eche. Eche, a colleague on the programme coordination team, who's been the instigator and lead on many of our demystifying papers. So, Eche, over to you.
Thank you, Guy. I consider myself extremely lucky for having the opportunity to work in Value in Nature program. I must have internalized it so much that I have forgotten to put my name on the slide. So one thing that was particularly important and exciting about Value in Nature program for me was that it is a genuinely interdisciplinary effort in everything that we did, from programs to events and publications. And one thing that you realize that it is a very exciting to work in an interdisciplinary research. It's great fun, but it's also riddled with information asymmetry. Most of us are experts in one thing, and we know pretty little or nothing in everything else. And we become quite pessimistic on a day-to-day basis, that we think not only that we don't know anything about the other topics, but nothing is known about them. And I think our objective has been in the program to dispel that a lot of work goes on, a lot of data there is, a lot of evidence there is, and the morning's keynote speakers were very encouraging that we need to just get on with what we know. And the demystifying papers came about to help with the language barriers, really, because we don't mix enough across disciplines, across sectors. We don't even mix enough across the departments of a given organization. And when we do, we have difficulty understanding each other because we use different words, different numbers, or we use the same words and same numbers but to mean different things, and it might take us months to figure out that we were talking in cross purposes the whole time. So demystifying series started because we all had lots of the same questions that we had to answer over and over again, and we didn't have a go-to document. There were lots of documents in all these topics that you'll see, but they weren't written by the community. And by community, I mean the community of the Valuing Nature program and network is that research providers and also research users coming together to write something. And we also wanted to make these series accessible, so accessible language, not jargon, where there is terminology we need to know about each other's work. We have glossaries in there, and not necessarily the final word on the subject, but definitely the first authoritative word. All of these are also printed, perhaps a little old-fashioned, but people who read them said it's also useful to have something physical you can plonk on someone's desk and say, read this, before you speak to me next time. And these have been very popular documents, I'm pleased to say. These three are particularly useful for the business management context. Economic valuation one, I think, printed and downloaded about 5,000 times. It's the most popular thing I've been involved in. And there are other ones on health, on shared and social values, arts and arts research, and I think a comic book is coming as part of not necessarily the demystifying series, but demystifying things. And who knew there were many definitions of health? We don't have many health professionals here, but lots of areas are crying out for this kind of demystifying papers to be written, and they're great fun to do. I hope it'll be one of the legacies of the program. So let me tell you briefly about the three. The economic valuation was, if you know me, not surprising, this was the first one I started. I do economic valuation of environment, natural capital assets, etc. And I thought when I first started this, there will be 10 of my friends who would survive through the process. 120 people joined and 118 survived. So it's a great, great way of bringing the community together because you have a product at the end and then they go out and spread the word. So I really recommend the experience. The reason why this is important for business is that it's all beyond carbon, and when we want to make business cases for business involvement and investment, we need to compare all these wonderful environmental benefits to financial costs and financial opportunity costs. So we need to talk the language of money, however incomplete and however insensitive it can be. It's a language that's worth learning, and this document gives the basics. The next one was on cost-benefit analysis. All economists and policy analysts in public sector has to read something, or I hope they do, something called the Treasury's Green Book. It tells you about how public sector business cases and appraisals are done, should be done, and tells you a little bit about how to broaden your inclusion of costs and benefits beyond a single organization, but for the benefit of the whole society. So this demystifying paper is an introduction to Green Book, if you like. This one was written by a particular expert, Martin Hurst, and also with input from the Treasury, people who work on the Green Book. Again, it's useful to understand the language if we want to do more public-private finance initiatives. We need to understand what principles we're working with. Finally, it's green finance. Demystifying green finance is the final in the series, and it's not a typo that the finance is big in the title. It's because this demystifying paper is more about understanding what finance is about to the environmental community, whether they're in academia, business, or policy. A lot of terminology in green finance. A lot of it means different things. But we have to get a handle on to be able to screen out the terms that we don't want to use in the future. So this document, again, with about 30, 40 participation from finance sector as well as environmental sector, operating at many levels and many sectors, trying to get through that fog and find the terms that would help. Understand the drivers of what's pushing for green finance, why our businesses and finance houses are interested, but what barriers there are, so what campaigns do we need to do going forward to make green finance beyond carbon again. There are a lot of examples, and I think what's left next is to write a demystifying paper on the green bit of green finance for the finance and business professionals. And if you're interested, I'm here all day. But now you got lunch, I think, right? Or maybe Peter? No? Okay. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ashley. So that brings our whirlwind tour of business relevance of activity under the Valuing Nature programme to an end. I'm sorry to impinge on your lunch hour a little bit here. We're almost finished. I'll just hand over. Peter, do you want to say a few things to wrap up? No, you're going to let people off. That's very nice of you. That's very nice of you. So we've concluded our retrospective. The afternoon is all about forward-looking and the emerging natural assets research and innovation agenda in support of business. Please reconvene, if you don't mind, at 1:30 sharp. It gives you almost 50 minutes to enjoy your lunch. We'll introduce this emerging agenda in session 3, and then we'll move straight into a breakout where you have your chance to make input and validation around this emerging agenda, and then we'll have a final wrap-up. We do aim to finish by 4:15 as per programme, and hope many of you will then want to stay on for drinks after. So please do enjoy your lunch and reconvene here in this room 1:30 sharp. Thank you.